There is a version of British history they teach in schools, and then there is the version buried in estate records, parliamentary debates, land deeds older than most countries, and the quiet transfer of fortunes so large they reshaped the physical landscape of an entire civilization. The version they teach you starts with kings and queens, battles and treaties, bloodlines stretching back to the Norman conquest. But kings and queens are almost never the ones who actually held the money. They held the crown. Somebody else held the ledger. This is the story of the families who ran Britain before the institution of the modern monarchy solidified into the symbolic fixture it is today. Not the Windsors, not even the Hanoverians or the Stuarts in the way most people think of them. The real story is older and stranger than any single dynasty. It is the story of houses so entrenched in the soil, so embedded in the wool trade and the church lands and the colonial ledgers and the parliamentary committees, that they did not need a throne to be powerful. They simply were. And when their money moved, when these ancient fortunes began to dissolve or transform or disappear into holding companies and trusts and offshore arrangements, no casual historian is ever likely to untangle. The landscape of Britain shifted with them. Villages emptied, grand houses fell to developers or turned into hotels. Titles persisted long after the land backing them was quietly sold. And in some cases, the money did not go anywhere most people would think to look. It crossed an ocean. It moved into territory that was not yet called America by anyone living, and it funded experiments in civilization whose consequences are still reverberating. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Someone is listening from a flat in Manchester at 2 in the morning. Someone else is in New Zealand at noon on a Tuesday. Someone might be sitting in an old farmhouse in Yorkshire, not knowing their kitchen floor was once part of a monastic estate, controlled by a family, whose name appears 3 times in the Domesday Book. Every location is part of this story somehow, because this story is everywhere once you learn how to look for it. The families we are talking about did not announce themselves. That is the first thing to understand. The loudest power in any society is almost never the deepest power. The monarchy was visible because visibility was part of its function. Ceremony, coronation, the rituals of divine right. All of that theatre served a purpose for the people performing it, and an equally important purpose for the people behind it, the ones who needed the theatre to continue so that attention stayed on the stage and not in the wings. Go back to before the conquest. Britain, in the decades leading up to 1066, was a mosaic of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, themselves layered over older Celtic systems, themselves layered over whatever arrangement existed before the Romans named everything and built roads through the middle of it. The idea of a single ruling family controlling Britain is a retrospective fiction. What actually existed was a constellation of great houses, thegns and ealdormen, regional powers whose authority over land and men was practical and immediate in ways that abstract royal authority often was not. The Earls of Mercia, for instance. By the time of Edward the Confessor, Leofric and his descendants controlled territory so vast that any king who wanted cooperation from the Midlands had to negotiate rather than command. Leofric's wife, the woman history remembered through a legend about riding naked through Coventry to relieve a tax burden, was in her own right a figure of economic significance. She endowed churches, controlled revenues, sat at the intersection of spiritual and temporal power in ways that the later Victorian mythologizing about her entirely missed. The story was never really about the horse ride. It was always about who was rich enough that even local taxation was a political event requiring a performance to address. The Godwinsons. Most people encounter this name in the context of Harold II and his death at Hastings, with or without an arrow through his eye, depending on which historian you prefer. But the Godwin family before the Battle of Hastings was something closer to a parallel government than a noble house in any ordinary sense. Earl Godwin himself had accumulated power under Cnut, survived a political exile that would have destroyed most men, and returned to dictate terms to the king who had exiled him. His sons held most of the major earldoms in England simultaneously. His daughter was the queen. The family was not serving the crown. The crown was, in a meaningful practical sense, a joint venture. When the Normans arrived and William consolidated his conquest through the next 20 years, one of the most important things he did was not the destruction of the old English nobility, though that happened, but the replacement of one system of entrenched family power with another. The names changed, the language of the court changed, the architecture changed most visibly, with those stone castles going up everywhere. Stone was the point, a message about permanence. But the underlying structure, the idea that real power in Britain lived in the hands of a small number of great families who held land and commanded men, and whose cooperation any effective ruler absolutely required, that did not change at all. It just got reorganized. And the new families were hungry in the way that only families who have recently acquired enormous wealth can be hungry. The de Clares, the de Montforts, the Bigods, the Bohuns, the Mortimers. These were not simply lords in the sense of men who owned estates and collected rents. They were military powers, judicial powers, ecclesiastical patrons, creditors, and in some cases, the direct ancestors of everyone who would matter in English politics for the next 4 centuries. The de Clare family alone controlled territory in England, Wales, and Ireland simultaneously during the peak of their influence in the 12th and 13th centuries. Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, did not just participate in the Norman invasion of Ireland. He ran it as a personal entrepreneurial venture. He arrived with an army, married the daughter of the local king he was supposed to be assisting, claimed territory, and effectively founded a dynasty that the English crown then spent years trying to manage, rather than the other way around. This is the pattern that repeats across centuries, with different names and different specific mechanisms, but the same underlying logic. The crown needed the great families more than the great families needed the crown, and both parties understood this perfectly well, even when they were pretending otherwise. The relationship between English monarchs and their most powerful subjects was always a negotiation, masquerading as obedience, and the moments when that mask slipped were the moments history calls crises. The Magna Carta is perhaps the clearest window into what the actual balance of power looked like. Every schoolchild in Britain learns that Magna Carta was about rights and liberty and the rule of law, and there is truth in that, eventually, in the way the document was reinterpreted across subsequent centuries. But the document John signed at Runnymede in 1215 was not primarily a philosophical statement. It was a list of specific grievances from specific barons about specific things the king had been doing with their money, their families, and their lands that they found intolerable. It was a contract, a very expensive contract, and the men who forced John to sign it were not idealists. They were the most powerful landowners in England, and they had brought an army. The Fitzwalters, the de Veres, the de Vesey family. These were the architects of the rebellion that produced the charter, and their motivations were almost entirely economic and territorial. John had been extorting money from the baronage through feudal technicalities, charging enormous reliefs when estates passed to heirs, manipulating wardships to extract revenue, using his position as the ultimate feudal lord to squeeze the families who sat just below him in the hierarchy. The barons had enough. The charter was, among other things, a statement that there were limits to what the crown could do to family wealth, and that those limits would be enforced by the sword if necessary. What most histories do not linger on is what happened to those same families over the following century. Because the great houses who forced John's hand, who put their seals to Magna Carta and their names on the witness lists, who rode to Runnymede with retinues and expectations, most of them did not maintain their position indefinitely. Some survived. Some were absorbed through marriage into other great houses. Some went extinct in the male line, and their lands were redistributed. Some made catastrophic political choices in the civil wars and rebellions that continued to punctuate the 13th century and lost everything in a single generation. But the money did not disappear. It moved. It transferred through dowries and debt settlements and the deliberate strategies of families who were very, very good at surviving. The great medieval families understood something that is still true about inherited wealth. Land can be taken, titles can be stripped, but financial instruments, the ability to call in debts, the connections to ecclesiastical institutions that controlled their own vast reserves, the relationships with continental moneylenders and trading networks, those were harder to destroy and easier to reconstitute in a new form. The wool trade is the key that unlocks the medieval English economy in a way that most general histories barely mention. England in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries was sitting on one of the most valuable natural resources in the known world, and that resource was sheep. English wool, particularly from the great monastic flocks of Yorkshire and the Cotswolds and the Welsh borders, was the raw material that fed the cloth industries of Flanders and Florence. The Italian banking families, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, the houses that would eventually become the foundation of what we now think of as modern finance. They were deeply embedded in the English wool trade. They lent money to English kings against future wool revenues. They organized the collection and export of the wool. They effectively ran the English customs system for long periods during the 14th century. And the great English families who controlled the grazing lands where the sheep lived were at the center of this system. The monasteries especially, Rievaulx Abbey, Fountains Abbey, Tintern. These were not merely spiritual institutions. They were agricultural enterprises of extraordinary scale and sophistication, with flocks numbering in the tens of thousands, with granges, outlying farms, spread across hundreds of miles, with written records and management systems that would not look out of place in a modern agricultural company. The abbots who ran them were businessmen as much as they were prelates, and the families who founded and patronized them received in return a complex mixture of spiritual benefits, administrative services, and economic partnership that made the monastery system one of the most important financial networks in medieval England. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, he was not simply attacking the church. He was redistributing the largest concentration of accumulated wealth in English history. And the redistribution was deliberate, strategic, and designed to create a new class of landowner, permanently dependent on the continuation of the Protestant settlement for the security of their titles. The families who purchased monastic lands, the Russells who got enormous grants in the West Country and became the Dukes of Bedford, the Cavendishes who began assembling what would become the Chatsworth estate, the Seymours, the Dudleys, all of them acquired their wealth through this single, unprecedented transfer of assets. This matters for understanding where British wealth came from, because the families who matter in British history from the 16th century onward are almost universally either families whose fortunes were founded in the dissolution or families who adapted quickly enough to attach themselves to those who did. The ancient nobility who had survived from before the conquest, the families who could genuinely trace themselves back to a companion of William's, were by 1540 either extinct or so diminished by centuries of dynastic accident, political miscalculation, and the ordinary attrition of time that they were no longer the dominant power. The new money was post-Reformation money, and it was hungry. The Cecils are the best case study of how this worked at the highest level. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, began his rise as a skilled bureaucrat and lawyer, the kind of man who could navigate the terrifying instability of the Tudor succession without getting killed. He served Edward VI, survived Mary I's Catholic restoration, and positioned himself so effectively that when Elizabeth came to the throne, he was her indispensable Secretary of State for decades. That position gave him access to information and patronage on a scale that was effectively impossible for anyone outside the inner circle to match. He accumulated estates, he built Burghley House, he married strategically, and married his children even more strategically. By the time he died in 1598, the Cecil family was not merely wealthy, it was structurally embedded in the English state in a way that no change of monarch could easily dislodge. His son, Robert Cecil, served James I with equal effectiveness, manoeuvred the Essex faction to destruction, and received in return a title and estates that confirmed the family's position at the very summit of English society. The Cecils are not a peripheral footnote. They are a template. the template for how a family moved from bureaucratic service, through land acquisition, through strategic marriage, into a position of hereditary power that would last for centuries, and that would eventually require no particular competence from individual members to maintain, because the institution of the family itself carried enough historical weight. The 17th century is where the story begins to get genuinely strange and genuinely relevant to questions about what happened to British wealth over the longer arc of history. The Civil War, the execution of Charles I, the interregnum, the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. These events, compressed into a single traumatic century, reshuffled the cards of English elite society with a thoroughness that had not been seen since the conquest. And the families who came out ahead were not necessarily the ones who had been ahead before. The parliamentarian cause in the Civil War was not a popular uprising in any meaningful modern sense. It was a faction within the English elite that had specific grievances about specific things, particularly about the Crown's attempts to raise money without parliamentary consent, and about perceived threats to the Protestant settlement that the families of the Reformation gentry had built their entire social position upon. The men who funded and led the parliamentary armies were almost universally substantial landowners. They were not fighting against the idea of inherited wealth and hereditary privilege. They were fighting to protect their own version of those things against a monarchy that seemed to be threatening them. Oliver Cromwell himself came from precisely this background. The Cromwells were a minor gentry family in Huntingdonshire, connected through his great-great-uncle to the Thomas Cromwell, who had been Henry VIII's chief minister during the dissolution of the monasteries. Oliver Cromwell's family had done very well out of the dissolution. His position as a landowner, modest by the standards of the great houses, but substantial enough to give him political standing, was built on the same post-Reformation foundation as the rest of the new gentry. What the Civil War did to the landscape of British wealth is only partly about the families that lost royalist estates confiscated and sold during the interregnum. It is equally about the families that used the chaos to buy. Confiscated royalist lands were sold at auction, and the buyers were overwhelmingly the kinds of commercially minded people who had liquid capital and the political connections to move safely through the period. Merchants from London, lawyers who had done well from the disruption of the legal system, military commanders who had received payment in land rather than money, new men who would over the following decades either establish new dynasties or intermarry with the old ones and become indistinguishable from them. The Restoration of 1660 reversed some of this, but not all of it. Charles II was pragmatic enough to understand that he could not actually restore everything to its pre-Civil War state without triggering another catastrophe. Some confiscated estates went back to their original families. Many did not. The legal situation was deliberately left ambiguous in places, which meant that families with good lawyers and patient strategies could often preserve what they had acquired during the interregnum, while the families who had lost the most and had the least legal sophistication found themselves impoverished permanently. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 is the moment that most clearly marks the definitive settlement of this question. William of Orange came to Britain with the backing of a coalition of Whig nobles who had specific constitutional and religious objectives, and he rewarded that backing in the way all successful usurpers reward their supporters, with positions, titles, and most importantly, the legislative framework that protected the specific type of property rights that the Whig families depended upon. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was not just a financial innovation. It was a political institution, a mechanism for binding the wealth of the nation to the Whig settlement in a way that made it practically impossible to undo without destroying the entire financial system. The families who founded and directed the Bank of England in those early years, the merchants and financiers who subscribed to its original capital, were participating in something that would shape British and eventually global finance for the next 3 centuries. And the overlap between those founding subscribers and the Whig aristocratic network that had engineered the Glorious Revolution is not a coincidence. It is the whole point. The Bank of England was the financial architecture of the Whig settlement, the mechanism by which political victory was translated into enduring structural advantage. This is the period when the boundaries between aristocratic and commercial wealth in Britain begin to blur in ways that historians have found difficult to categorize cleanly. The great Whig families were landowners, certainly, with estates covering enormous areas of the country. But they were also investors, shareholders, patrons of trading companies, participants in the financial networks that were beginning to extend across the Atlantic and into Asia. The East India Company was not primarily a commercial enterprise in these years. It was a political entity with its own army and its own territorial ambitions. And its major shareholders were the same families who sat in Parliament and controlled appointments in the Navy and the Customs Service. The interlocking nature of these relationships is difficult to overstate. Sir Josiah Child, who effectively controlled the East India Company in the 1680s and 1690s, was simultaneously a major landowner in Essex, a significant figure in the financial networks that supported the Bank of England, and a political operator of considerable skill who used his wealth to purchase parliamentary influence in ways that would be recognized as straightforwardly corrupt by modern standards, but were simply the normal operating procedure of the period. Child's fortune and the political power it represented flowed back and forth between commercial investment, land ownership, and parliamentary control in a continuous circuit that made the idea of separating economic from political power essentially meaningless. What was happening in Britain in these decades was the consolidation of a system, not a conspiracy in the sense of people meeting in rooms and making explicit plans, but a convergence of interests so powerful and so self-reinforcing that it required no explicit coordination to maintain itself. The people at the top of British society understood implicitly that the system worked for them, that the laws were written to protect their type of property, that the courts interpreted those laws in ways that preserved their advantages, and that the financial institutions were structured to reward their kind of capital. They did not need to plan this. They simply needed to continue doing what had made them wealthy in the first place, and the system would continue to generate outcomes favorable to people like them. The 18th century is when the money starts moving in ways that have permanent consequences for places far beyond Britain, and this is where the story starts to intersect with questions about pre-Columbian North America and the deep history of a continent that British families were actively trying to reshape in the image of the world they had built at home. But before we get to the Atlantic crossing, we need to understand the domestic picture more completely, because the 18th century in Britain is simultaneously a period of extraordinary aristocratic confidence and the beginning of processes that would eventually hollow out the aristocratic position entirely. Both things were true at the same time, and the families who understood this earliest were the ones who survived longest. The great Whig aristocracy in its 18th century prime was something genuinely remarkable. The Dukes of Newcastle, of Devonshire, of Bedford, of Grafton. These families ran British politics not through any formal constitutional mechanism, but through the simple fact of enormous wealth combined with the patronage system that allowed great landowners to control parliamentary boroughs, then ecclesiastical appointments, military commissions, and government contracts. The Duke of Newcastle, Thomas Pelham Holles, was Prime Minister twice and held major offices of state for most of his adult life, and his ability to do so rested entirely on his capacity to deploy the wealth and patronage of the Pelham Holles family in service of the political coalitions he needed to maintain. The rotten boroughs, the pocket boroughs, the system by which a handful of voters controlled a parliamentary seat because the seat had been in a particular family's pocket since time immemorial. This was not a peripheral abuse of the constitutional system. It was the constitutional system. It was how the great families translated their economic power into political power in a way that could be passed to heirs and managed like any other asset. Ownership of a borough was listed in estate inventories alongside timber rights and advowsons, the right to appoint church clergy, because they were all the same type of asset, a revenue stream and a power multiplier packaged into a form that could be bought, sold, and inherited. The Cavendish family's control of Derbyshire politics, the Spencer family's dominance of Northamptonshire, the Howard family's grip on Norfolk. These were not about ideology or political philosophy. They were about the economics of power, the calculation that the cost of maintaining control of a parliamentary seat was more than offset by the value of the patronage and the policy influence that control provided. And the families who were best at this calculation were, not coincidentally, the families who had the most resources to invest in it. Wealth generated political power, which generated more wealth in an ascending spiral that was very difficult to interrupt from outside. What interrupted it eventually was not a revolution. Britain did not have a revolution in the 18th century, despite having excellent opportunities to do so. What interrupted it was change in the underlying economic structure that made the landed aristocracy's position increasingly precarious, even as it appeared, to casual observation, to be at its most secure. The Industrial Revolution is conventionally dated to the second half of the 18th century, and in terms of the physical infrastructure of factories and canals and steam engines, that dating is broadly accurate. But the financial and organizational preconditions for the Industrial Revolution were built over a much longer period, and the families who benefited most from early industrialization were not always the families who had been wealthy before it. The great aristocratic landowners who happened to have coal under their fields, the Fitzwilliams in Yorkshire, the Bridgewaters in Lancashire, the Lambtons in County Durham, did extraordinarily well. But the aristocracy as a class was not the primary driver or beneficiary of industrial capital accumulation. That was a new class, or rather a collection of new individuals and families who were building wealth through manufacturing and commerce in ways that the landed system was not equipped to absorb or control. This is the moment when British wealth begins to diversify in ways that eventually make it impossible to track through traditional, genealogical, or estate history. The money that had been concentrated in land and in the political structures built around land began to flow into industrial enterprises, into financial instruments, into the kind of mobile capital that could be moved across borders and invested in projects that had nothing to do with any particular piece of English soil. And one of the most important directions it flowed was across the Atlantic. The connection between British aristocratic and merchant wealth and the colonization of North America is not a peripheral footnote in the history of either place. It is central to both. The Virginia Company, founded in 1606, was a joint stock enterprise in which many of the most prominent families of Jacobean England had invested. The investors included not only merchants, but earls and lords, men for whom a share in the Virginia Company represented the same kind of speculative investment that a share in the East India Company represented, a bet on the future productivity of a place that was currently generating losses, but promised eventual returns that would justify the patience and the capital. The governance of early Virginia was effectively the governance of a corporate enterprise, and the men who sat on the Virginia Company's council in London were the same men who sat on the councils of other trading companies and who moved through the financial and political networks of Jacobean London. The Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron and the dedicatee of the narrative poems, was also a major figure in the Virginia Company and a significant investor in American colonization. The worlds that seem entirely separate to us, the world of Renaissance literary patronage and the world of transatlantic commercial colonization, were in fact the same world viewed from different angles. But Virginia was only the beginning, and the Virginia Company model was only one of the mechanisms by which British capital moved into the North American continent. The various proprietorial colonies, Maryland, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, New York, under English rule, were all granted to specific individuals or groups of individuals by royal charter, and those individuals and groups were almost universally drawn from the same interlocking network of families, merchants, and political insiders that we have been tracing through domestic British history. William Penn's Pennsylvania is worth dwelling on because it illustrates several of the themes of this story with unusual clarity. Penn himself came from a family that had done very well out of the Civil War period and its aftermath. His father was an admiral who had served both Cromwell and Charles II with equal effectiveness, precisely the kind of pragmatic survivor that turbulent periods generate. The elder Penn had accumulated enough royal favor that when he died, Charles II owed his estate a substantial sum, and the solution to that debt was the charter that gave the younger Penn proprietorial rights over a vast territory in North America. Pennsylvania was therefore in its origin a debt settlement, a transfer of value from the crown to a specific family, denominated not in cash or land in England, but in the theoretical future value of territory on a continent that was not empty, whatever the legal fictions of the charter declared, but that was home to populations of human beings whose presence and whose own systems of land tenure and governance were simply not acknowledged by the legal instruments the British were writing. Penn was, by the standards of his time, unusually thoughtful about his relationship with the indigenous people of the territories he had been granted. He made treaties. He paid for land, rather than simply declaring it already his by right of charter. His colony had a reputation, at least in its early decades, for somewhat less violent dispossession than was common elsewhere on the colonial frontier. But even Penn's most ethically attentive approach was built on the foundational assumption that the charter was legitimate, that the land was his to grant and negotiate over, and that the eventual outcome would be a British society layered over or alongside the existing inhabitants of the place. This matters for the deeper question this story is building toward, which is the question of what was already in North America before the British and the French and the Spanish and the Dutch began writing their legal documents over the top of it. Because here is where British aristocratic history and American pre-Columbian history begin to intersect in ways that are genuinely surprising, and that the mainstream telling of both histories has consistently underemphasized. The continent the British were colonizing in the 17th and 18th centuries was not wilderness. It had been inhabited for at least 15,000 years, and possibly much longer. The human societies that had developed across that enormous landmass were enormously diverse, ranging from the mound-building cultures of the Mississippi Valley and the Ohio River Basin, through the sophisticated agricultural civilizations of the Southwest, through the coastal fishing cultures of the Pacific Northwest, through the confederacies of the Northeast, through dozens of other distinct ways of organizing human life that had evolved over millennia in specific relationship to specific landscapes. The mound builders of the Mississippi Valley are perhaps the most dramatic evidence of what pre-Columbian North America actually looked like at its most organizationally sophisticated. Cahokia, the great city near what is now East St. Louis in Illinois, was at its peak in the 11th and 12th centuries, a settlement of perhaps 20,000 people or more, with a central pyramid-shaped mound larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city had a planned layout with plazas and wood-henge structures that appear to have been used for astronomical observation, with specialized craft production areas, with evidence of long-distance trade networks bringing copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf Coast and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. Cahokia was not a small village. It was a city, and the civilization of which it was the largest center extended across the Mississippi and Ohio river systems for hundreds of miles, with hundreds of subsidiary mounds and sites organized in what archaeologists are still working to understand as a coherent political and religious geography. By the time Europeans arrived in the interior of North America in significant numbers, Cahokia had been abandoned for 2 centuries. The reasons for this abandonment are still debated. Climate change, the medieval warm period giving way to the Little Ice Age and affecting agricultural productivity, political fragmentation following the decline of the religious and political authority that had held the Cahokian system together, disease, perhaps transmitted along the same trade networks that had been the system's greatest strength, ecological stress from the demands of a large urban population on its surrounding landscape, probably some combination of all of these. But the absence of Cahokia when Europeans arrived does not mean the absence of its legacy. The cultures that Europeans encountered across the Mississippi Valley were not entirely separate from what Cahokia had been. They were its descendants, carrying forward elements of the cosmological, the agricultural, and the political systems that the Mississippian culture had developed. The mounds were still there, mostly, hundreds of them, thousands if you count smaller constructions, and the people living near them often maintained traditions and relationships with those mounds that encoded real historical memory, even if the specific political system that had built them was gone. What the British colonizers did with this landscape is one of the stranger stories in the history of the relationship between inherited wealth and territorial acquisition. Because the great families, the aristocrats and merchants who held proprietorial charters, who owned shares in land companies, who sat on the boards of organizations like the Ohio Company of Virginia, which was incorporated in 1747 to explore and settle the Ohio Valley, were not simply taking empty land. They were taking land that had a human history, stretching back further than Britain itself had been continuously inhabited by anatomically modern humans. And they were translating that land into the same kinds of legal and financial instruments that had been developed over centuries of English property law. The Ohio Company of Virginia had investors that read like a directory of the Virginian planter class at its most ambitious. Lawrence Washington, George Washington's older brother, was among the incorporators. The Fairfax family, who held the Northern Neck Proprietary, a grant of land between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers that covered millions of acres, were connected to the same network. Thomas Fairfax, the sixth Baron Fairfax of Cameron, was the only British peer resident in colonial America in the mid-18th century, living on his estate in the Shenandoah Valley and defending his proprietorial interests in the colonial courts with the same tenacity that any English landlord would apply to defending his estate in an English court. The young George Washington worked as a surveyor for the Fairfax interests before he became a soldier and then a revolutionary. His work was literal, going out into the landscape that was being claimed and measured and mapped and translated into parcels that could be described in legal instruments and registered and bought and sold. The same process, the translation of living landscape into abstract property, that had been applied to England through enclosure and to Ireland through plantation, was being applied to North America through survey. And the surveyors were not working in a vacuum. They were working in a landscape that had been shaped over millennia by human decisions, where the paths they were following were often ancient paths, where the river crossings they were using had been used for thousands of years, where the high ground they were choosing for observation posts had been used as observation posts and ceremonial sites by cultures whose names were not recorded in any European document. The great Hopewell tradition, which flourished in the Ohio Valley from roughly 2,000 years ago until about 1,500 years ago, left physical structures in that landscape that the British surveyors and colonists encountered and commented on, usually without any framework for understanding what they were seeing. Earthworks of extraordinary scale and precision, geometric enclosures covering hundreds of acres, combined with burial mounds containing objects of copper and mica and obsidian and pearl that had come from sources hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles distant. The Hopewell earthworks near present-day Newark, Ohio, covered 4 square miles of precisely laid-out geometric forms, circles and octagons and parallel walls connecting them, with alignments that archaeologists have demonstrated correspond to the movements of the moon over its 18-year cycle. This is not accidental. This is the result of sustained astronomical observation over generations, combined with organizational capacity sufficient to direct the labor of thousands of people in the construction of precisely engineered earthworks, combined with mathematical understandings of the relationship between celestial movements and terrestrial geometry, that the European visitors who encountered these structures in the 17th and 18th centuries consistently refused to attribute to their indigenous builders. Because the alternative, acknowledging that the continent they were claiming had been home to sophisticated civilizations with their own sciences and their own religions and their own systems of meaning, was inconvenient for the legal and moral framework of colonization. The terra nullius doctrine, the legal fiction, that land with no European-style agricultural improvement and no European-style political institutions was effectively unowned, required a particular way of seeing the landscape. The mounds were inconvenient. They were obvious evidence of organized human activity on a large scale. The British colonizers dealt with this inconvenience in several ways. Some simply ignored the mounds or treated them as natural features. Others developed elaborate alternative explanations for their origin. The lost tribe theory, the idea that the mounds had been built, not by the ancestors of the people currently living near them, but by some vanished civilization. Perhaps Hebrews, perhaps Phoenicians, perhaps Welsh under Prince Madoc, perhaps some mythological pre-Columbian civilization that had since disappeared, was not a fringe idea. It was the mainstream interpretation of the mound builders among educated Euro-American writers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Thomas Jefferson, who was as curious and empirically minded as any figure of his generation, actually excavated one of the mounds on his Virginia plantation, and his account of the excavation in Notes on the State of Virginia is recognizable as an early attempt at systematic archaeological investigation. Jefferson correctly concluded from his excavation that the mound was a burial monument and that it had been constructed in multiple phases over time. He did not conclude that it had been built by ancient Hebrews or Welsh or Phoenicians. He concluded that it had been built by ancestors of the people currently living in the region. But Jefferson's rational conclusion was a minority view. The lost civilization theory persisted and it expanded in ways that served very specific ideological purposes. If the mound builders were a vanished civilization that had been replaced by the current indigenous people, rather than the direct ancestors of those people, then the indigenous people could not claim the mounds as evidence of their historical presence in the landscape. The land could be more cleanly characterized as empty of continuous human possession. The legal and moral case for colonization became somewhat easier to make, or at least to maintain in the face of the physical evidence that someone had been there before and had built things that lasted. The British families and their American colonial counterparts who were making fortunes from land acquisition, from the Ohio Company to the land speculation schemes that consumed enormous amounts of the energy of the founding generation of American leaders, had a financial interest in the ideological infrastructure that made their acquisitions seem legitimate. And that ideological infrastructure required a particular story about the landscape, one in which the ancient mounds were mysterious relics of a vanished people, rather than the monuments of living cultural traditions whose rights to the land needed to be taken seriously. This is where the money and the myth intersect. The great British families who had funded the colonization of North America, who held shares in land companies and proprietorial grants, who had invested in the speculative futures of territories that were still being fought over and described and surveyed, were simultaneously participants in the creation of a particular historical narrative about North America, one that denied the sophistication and the continuous presence of pre-Columbian civilization in order to make the transfer of that civilization's territory into European-descended ownership seem more natural and more inevitable than it actually was. The Howard family's involvement in the American colonies, the Berkeley family, whose proprietorial interests in Carolina were eventually dissolved, but whose participation in the early colonial enterprise shaped the landscape of the Southeast, the Calvert family, the Lords Baltimore, who held Maryland as a proprietary colony for nearly a century, and whose descendants are still a presence in the historical memory of that state. These families were not simply investors in a commercial venture. They were participants in a process of civilizational transfer, the replacement of one set of relationships to land with another, and the wealth they extracted from that process flowed back to Britain in ways that are genuinely difficult to trace through conventional financial history. Tobacco revenues, timber revenues, land sales, the profits from indentured labor, and then from enslaved labor, which is the darkest and most consequential of all the streams of value that flowed from the American colonies back to the British families who had funded the enterprise. The connection between British aristocratic wealth and the slave trade is not a peripheral or disputed historical fact. It is one of the best documented transfers of value in all of British economic history. The Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project, based at University College London, has produced the most comprehensive accounting available of the compensation paid by the British government when slavery was abolished in 1833. The Slavery Abolition Act provided £20 million sterling in compensation, not to the enslaved people who were freed, but to the people who had legally owned them. £20 million in 1833 money is a figure that, translated into modern economic context, using the measure of its share of national income, represents something in the range of 17 to 20 billion pounds today. And the recipients of that compensation were a cross-section of exactly the social world this story has been describing. Aristocrats, members of parliament, clergy, merchants, the kinds of families whose names appear throughout the documentary history of British elite society. The Gladstone family, whose most famous son, William Ewart Gladstone, would be Prime Minister 4 times, and was in many respects the defining political figure of Victorian progressive liberalism, received compensation for over 2,000 enslaved people on their Jamaican plantations. The Codrington family, who had given a library to All Souls College, Oxford, that still bears their name, had built their fortune on Barbadian slavery. The Beckford family, whose patriarch William Beckford had been Lord Mayor of London twice, had made an enormous fortune from Jamaican sugar plantations worked by enslaved people, and that fortune had funded the construction of Fonthill Abbey, one of the most extravagant Gothic architectural fantasies ever built in England. The money from slavery was spent on houses and art collections and parliamentary seats and marriages. It was converted through the mechanisms of English elite society into the kind of permanent hereditary wealth that looks entirely natural and indigenous to Britain once enough generations have passed. The great country houses that now attract tourists and location scouts for period dramas were often built or maintained on money that had crossed the Atlantic from the labor of enslaved people on Caribbean plantations. The families that owned them, or that owned them before they were handed to the National Trust or converted to other uses, are in many cases the direct descendants of people who received compensation in 1833. This is where the story of British aristocratic wealth and the story of the pre-Columbian Americas connect in a way that is not immediately obvious but becomes clear when you follow the money carefully. Because the wealth extracted from the Americas, through the land, through the labor, through the resources, was always flowing back to Britain. And when it arrived, it was immediately converted into the kind of stable, inherited, institutionally protected wealth that the British system had spent centuries developing the infrastructure to create and maintain. The country house is the physical monument of this process. There are roughly 1,000 large country houses surviving in England alone, with perhaps another 300 or 400 in Wales and Scotland, that were built or substantially rebuilt between the 17th and 19th centuries. Each one of them represents an accumulation of capital that had to come from somewhere. And the sources of that capital, when you trace them, are almost always some combination of agricultural rents from English estates, profits from trade and manufacturing, income from colonial enterprises, and in very many cases, some element of the slave trade or slave-produced commodities. The Lascelles family and Harewood House in Yorkshire. The profits from Barbadian plantations built one of the finest neoclassical houses in England, designed by John Carr and Robert Adam, decorated with furniture by Thomas Chippendale, filled with paintings and objects that collectively constitute a significant portion of Britain's national artistic heritage. The Lascelles family became the Earls of Harewood. Their descendants through the female line include members of the current royal family. The money moved through generations and through marriages until it became indistinguishable from Old English money, which is partly the point. John Gladstone, the father of the Prime Minister, had plantations in Demerara, which is now part of Guyana, as well as Jamaica. The compensation he received in 1833 enabled him to maintain and expand his family's wealth during the transition away from slavery. His son, William, began his political career as a Tory defending slavery and ended it as a Liberal Prime Minister associated with reform and expansion of democracy. The money that funded the career was the same money, regardless of the political positions taken. The transformation of slave-derived capital into respectable British political capital is one of the most complete and successful launderings of morally problematic wealth in all of history. Not because it was hidden, it was not hidden, it was a matter of public record, but because the social systems that translated it into hereditary status were so powerful and so normalized that the origin became invisible. But what happened to British aristocratic wealth in the longer run? After the Victorian era, after the death duties introduced by Lloyd George's budget of 1909, after the agricultural depression of the late 19th century that had already begun to undermine the rental income on which so many estates depended, after the First World War that killed so many heirs and imposed enormous costs in both direct taxation and indirect economic disruption, after the Second World War and its aftermath. This is the question that the current landscape of Britain answers if you know how to read it. The answer is that some of it simply evaporated. Estates were broken up and sold, houses were demolished, and an astonishing number of great houses were demolished in the 20th century. The architectural historians John Harris and Marcus Binney estimated that over 1,000 country houses were lost between 1880 and 1980, a statistic that inspired the 1974 exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum called The Destruction of the English Country House, which was one of the catalysts for the heritage conservation movement. The wealth that had built those houses dissolved into the economy, converted from built assets into liquid capital, much of which moved through entirely non-transparent channels. Some went into trusts, many of them offshore. The use of tax havens by British aristocratic wealth is not a recent phenomenon. The mechanisms have changed, but the practice of moving wealth into structures that minimize the inheritance taxes and income taxes that would otherwise erode it has been a preoccupation of the British wealthy for as long as there have been taxes sufficiently onerous to justify the legal costs of avoiding them. The Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Bermuda, Cayman. The destinations have changed over the decades as different jurisdictions offer different combinations of legal security and tax advantage. But the direction of travel has been consistent. The families who managed the transition from landed aristocracy to financial aristocracy most successfully were the ones who understood earliest that the specific form of their wealth, land denominated as an English estate with English tenants, was becoming a liability rather than an asset, and who converted their landholdings into liquid capital before the conversion became forced rather than voluntary. The Dukes of Bedford, the Russell family, owned enormous estates in Bloomsbury in central London, which had been agricultural land that grew into the city. Rather than simply collecting ground rents, they developed their Bloomsbury estate in ways that turned agricultural land value into urban commercial and residential value, and eventually they negotiated the continuation of their income stream in ways that survived even when they eventually sold or transferred the freehold of much of the estate. The ground rent system, by which the freeholder maintains an income from the land even after granting long leases on the buildings above it, is a specifically British legal mechanism for preserving the income of the original landowner through periods of change that would otherwise erode their position. The Grosvenor family, the Dukes of Westminster, perhaps the richest aristocratic family in Britain by the late 20th century, built their position not on agricultural land, but on the development of Mayfair and Belgravia in London. Their ancestor, Sir Thomas Grosvenor, had married Mary Davies in 1677, a wealthy heiress whose assets included 100 acres of market gardens and pasture west of what was then London, known as the Ebury Estate. The Grosvenors sat on that land as London expanded around it, developing it through ground leases rather than outright sales, which meant that when the leases eventually expired, the freehold value had multiplied many times over and still belonged to the Grosvenors. The Duke of Westminster in the 21st century is one of the wealthiest individuals in Britain, not because his family found oil or built a technology company, but because his ancestor married the right woman in 1677 and the subsequent dukes were patient. Patience is perhaps the single most important characteristic of successful dynastic wealth management. The families that maintained wealth across multiple generations in Britain were almost never the most aggressive or the most innovative. They were the most patient, the most institutionally stable, the most careful about converting wealth from vulnerable forms to protected forms before the vulnerability became acute. But patience is only available to families that survive the crises that eliminate the less patient, and the great crises of British aristocratic survival in the 20th century, the death duties, the income tax, the agricultural depression, The wars. These eliminated a substantial proportion of the old families. The ones that survived were disproportionately the ones with urban land, the ones with diversified investment portfolios rather than purely agricultural income, the ones with good lawyers and accountants who had moved money into protected structures before the taxes caught up with it. And a surprising number of those survivors moved money across the Atlantic, not back across the Atlantic in the direction of the earlier colonial flow, but into the new American financial structures that the 20th century created. British aristocratic capital in American real estate, in American financial instruments, in American commercial enterprises is not a small or peripheral phenomenon. The Cavendish connection to American banking, the various investments that great British families made in American railroads and land during the 19th century, when American capital markets were developing rapidly and offering returns that exceeded anything available in the slower-growing British economy. The Baring Brothers Bank, founded in 1762 by Francis Baring, a son of a Devon merchant family, was by the late 19th century one of the most important conduits for European investment in American infrastructure. The Argentine crisis of 1890 nearly destroyed the bank, and its rescue by the Bank of England was one of the defining moments of Victorian financial history. But Baring survived until 1995 and the Nick Leeson derivatives disaster, a run of 2 centuries and more as a significant vehicle for the movement of British capital into overseas investments. The money moves. This is the central lesson of tracing aristocratic wealth over long periods. It does not stay in one place or one form. It converts from land to financial instruments, to company shares, to property, in different locations, to trusts and foundations. It crosses national boundaries. It moves through family connections and through professional intermediaries, through lawyers and bankers and accountants whose job is precisely to maintain the value of the underlying wealth through transformations that make it difficult for any external observer, and particularly any tax authority, to track comprehensively. Now we need to go deeper into the question of what was in North America before the British money arrived, because the story of pre-Columbian civilization in North America is vastly more complex and more contested than mainstream history has been willing to acknowledge, and the reasons for that unwillingness are intimately connected to the economic interests of the British and later American families whose claim to the land depended on a particular story about what had been there before them. The Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, is one of the most mysterious and debated of all the surviving pre-Columbian earthworks in North America. A quarter-mile-long effigy of a serpent, or perhaps a serpent with a coiled tail, or perhaps a serpent with an egg in its mouth, depending on how you interpret the terminal feature, built on a ridge above Brush Creek. The ridge itself appears to be on the location of a meteor impact crater, or possibly a volcanic structure, an unusual geological feature that seems too specific to be a coincidence in the choice of site. The serpent's coils align with the summer solstice sunset and the winter solstice sunrise and the equinox points, or at least some combination of astronomical events depending on which reconstruction you find most convincing. Dating the Serpent Mound has been difficult. Different dating analyses have produced dates ranging from about 1,000 years ago in the Fort Ancient period to as much as 2,000 to 3,000 years ago in the Adena period, and there has been professional disagreement about which dating is correct that has not been fully resolved. The uncertainty is frustrating and genuinely interesting because the date affects the cultural attribution, which affects the interpretation, which feeds into the larger question of who built it and what it meant. But here is what is not in dispute. Someone built it. Someone decided that this particular ridge, over this particular geological feature, was the right place to construct a quarter-mile effigy oriented to astronomical events. That decision required knowledge, organizational capacity, religious or cosmological motivation, and physical labor on a scale that implies a population center nearby. It was not built by a small family group. It was a community project, possibly a regional project, of significant scale. The Adena culture, named for the estate in Ohio where the first systematically excavated burial mound of this type was described, was the Thomas Worthington Estate, Adena, near Chillicothe, Ohio, and Worthington was himself a governor of Ohio and a figure in the same kind of early American elite network that connects back through various threads to the British families and the colonial capital that had funded the settlement of the region. The naming of a pre-Columbian culture after an early 19th century American political figure's estate says something in itself about how the history was being framed and who had the cultural authority to frame it. The Adena culture, which spanned roughly from 1000 BCE to 200 CE, overlapping with and eventually giving way to the Hopewell tradition, was characterized by burial mounds, often conical in shape, containing the remains of individuals who had clearly been of significant social status, accompanied by grave goods of considerable elaboration. Copper ornaments, stone tablets with engraved designs, mica cutouts, tubular pipes, objects whose technical sophistication and artistic refinement are not consistent with the image of primitive foragers that the 19th and early 20th century popular literature on pre-Columbian North America promoted. The Hopewell interaction sphere, as archaeologists call it, is one of the most remarkable phenomena in the prehistory of any continent. From roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE, there was an exchange network centered on the Ohio Valley that distributed materials and objects across an enormous geographic area, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Yellowstone area, copper from the Lake Superior region, shark teeth from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians, alligator teeth from Florida. All of these materials found their way into Hopewell burial contexts in Ohio, hundreds or thousands of miles from their origin. This was not random. This was organized, sustained exchange over generations, which implies the existence of social and political institutions capable of maintaining long-distance relationships, of establishing trust between distant communities, of creating and enforcing the rules of exchange that made the network function. It implies something more like diplomacy than like occasional trading, something more like a continental system of connected polities than like isolated bands with occasional contact. The cosmological dimensions of the Hopewell system are equally remarkable. The geometric earthworks, with their precise astronomical alignments, appear to encode a cosmology, a set of beliefs about the relationship between the earthly world and the celestial world, that was sophisticated enough to require sustained astronomical observation over generations and mathematical understanding, sufficient to translate those observations into precisely laid out physical structures. The alignment of the Newark earthworks to the lunar standstill cycle, which takes 18 years to complete, means that the people who designed those earthworks were tracking the moon's movements over a period of time longer than a human childhood. They were accumulating astronomical knowledge across generations and translating it into architecture at a scale that required coordinated labor on the order of thousands of person-years. When European observers, many of whom were educated people with considerable exposure to classical antiquity, first described these earthworks in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the most common response was something like these must have been built by someone else. The someone else was variously identified as lost Israelites, ancient Greeks, medieval Welsh, Roman explorers, or some entirely mythological pre-Columbian civilization. The actual indigenous people of the region were consistently excluded from the authorship of their own ancestors' monuments. Thomas Jefferson's correct conclusion that the Virginia burial mound he excavated was built by ancestors of contemporary Native Americans was largely ignored. The lost civilization theory was developed most systematically in the early 19th century by figures like Caleb Atwater, who produced the first comprehensive survey of Ohio earthworks, but attributed them to a vanished Hindu or Hindu people from Asia. E.G. Squire and E.H. Davis, whose 1848 publication, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was the founding document of American archaeology as a scientific discipline, were more careful about attributing the mounds, but their work was still interpreted by many readers through the lost civilization framework. The reason this matters for the story of British aristocratic wealth is precisely because the lost civilization framework served specific economic and political interests. If the mound builders were a vanished civilization unrelated to the current indigenous people, then there was no living claimant to the cultural heritage of the mounds, no community whose relationship to the landscape needed to be taken seriously as a legal or moral impediment to the transfer of that landscape into British and later American ownership. The ideological work of erasing the connection between living indigenous people and their archaeological heritage was done in service of the economic interests of the families who were acquiring that heritage's territory. And some of those families had names that echo through this entire story. The Virginia land speculators of the 18th century, whose investments in Ohio Valley land eventually generated the legal and military conflicts that produced both the American Revolution and the subsequent dispossession of indigenous peoples from the Ohio Valley, were drawing on capital that traced back through the Virginia planter class to the colonial investment networks of the 17th century, which themselves drew on the British aristocratic and merchant capital that had funded the original colonial enterprise. George Washington's land speculation in the Ohio Valley was not a peripheral activity. He acquired tens of thousands of acres of western land, more than most people know, and the legal complications surrounding that land, which had been surveyed and claimed in ways that the British government's 1763 proclamation line forbade, were among the grievances that turned him from a loyal British subject into a revolutionary. The money that funded the colonial system, the British aristocratic capital that had made the Virginia planter class possible, created the conditions for its own supersession when the colonial economy became large enough to resent the controls that the metropolitan power attempted to impose on it. The American Revolution, from the perspective of British aristocratic wealth, was a loss and a transformation, and, eventually, an opportunity. The immediate loss was real. Loyalist families who had built their positions in the colonial system lost their estates. Proprietorial grants were voided. The specific legal instruments through which British families had controlled American land were dissolved. The Penns lost Pennsylvania, though not without a financial settlement. The Calverts had already been displaced from Maryland before the Revolution. The various proprietary interests in the Carolinas had been bought out by the Crown decades earlier. But the capital that had flowed from America to Britain did not simply vanish. It had been converted, over the preceding century and a half, into exactly the kinds of stable assets that survived political upheaval. Houses, land in Britain, bank deposits, East India Company shares, Bank of England stock. Consols, the British government perpetual bonds that were the safest asset in the 18th century world. The families who had made money from American colonial enterprise and converted it into British assets before the Revolution were insulated from the specific loss of their American properties. The money had already moved, and after a relatively brief period of adjustment, the money began moving back. British investors in the new American Republic found opportunities that the disruption of independence had created. American land values were still low relative to European equivalents. American governments, both state and federal, needed to borrow money, and the London financial market was the most sophisticated and liquid in the world. The same financial families, the Barings, the Rothschilds, who managed government borrowing for European states, also managed it for the new American state. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the transaction by which the United States acquired from France the territory that would eventually become 15 American states, was financed partly through Baring Brothers. The financial infrastructure of the early American Republic ran largely through London. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply how capital markets worked. The most liquid capital was concentrated in London because that is where the most sophisticated financial infrastructure existed, and the most sophisticated financial infrastructure existed in London because the British state and the British aristocratic and commercial elite had been building it for a century. When the Americans needed to borrow, they borrowed where the money was. The effect of this was that British capital continued to shape American development long after the formal end of British political control. British investment in American railroads during the 19th century was enormous. The infrastructure that connected the American continent was partly built with money that originated in British estates, in British trading companies, in British financial institutions, with roots going back to the period we have been examining. The families that owned that capital, often through the intermediary of financial institutions rather than directly, were participating in the development of the same continent that their ancestors had begun colonizing 2.5 centuries earlier, now through financial rather than political mechanisms. But all of this, the colonial enterprise, the aristocratic wealth, the financial infrastructure, the American development, rests on a landscape that had its own history stretching back far beyond any of it. And that history, the pre-Columbian history of North America, is still being excavated and reinterpreted, and in some cases profoundly revised as new evidence accumulates. The story of contact between the Old World and the Americas before Columbus is one of the most contested areas in all of archaeological and historical scholarship, and the controversy is inseparable from the political and economic interests that shaped the historical narrative in the first place. The official position in mainstream archaeology is still that Columbus's 1492 voyage represents the first sustained contact between Old World and New World civilizations, with the single exception of Norse contact with North America around 1000 CE. The Norse presence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered in the 1960s and now thoroughly established by both archaeological and literary evidence, is the one pre-Columbian contact story that mainstream scholarship accepts fully. But there is a substantial body of evidence, some of it more convincing than others, that suggests the picture is more complicated. The sweet potato, a plant native to South America, was present in Polynesia before Columbus, which implies contact between South American and Polynesian people well before European voyaging in the Pacific. The genetic evidence for this contact is now quite strong. Chicken bones from a pre-Columbian site in Chile have been tested and showed genetic signatures consistent with a Pacific island rather than European origin. The contact happened. The mechanism is not fully established, but it happened. The question of pre-Columbian contact between Europe and North America is more contested, but the dismissal of the evidence has not always been purely empirical. There are archaeological findings that do not fit comfortably into the standard model, and the treatment of those findings has sometimes reflected the cultural assumptions of the people evaluating them as much as the objective quality of the evidence. The copper trade is one of the genuinely mysterious aspects of pre-Columbian North American history. The Lake Superior region contains one of the largest deposits of native copper in the world. Copper that occurs in metallic form without requiring smelting, which makes it available to cultures without Iron Age metallurgy. And the quantity of copper extracted from this region in pre-Columbian times is staggering. Estimates suggest that hundreds of millions of pounds of copper were mined from Lake Superior in the pre-Columbian period. The Hopewell and Adena cultures used considerable amounts of copper in their ritual objects. Earlier cultures, conventionally grouped under the label of the Old Copper Complex, were working native copper into tools and ornaments as early as 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. But the volume of copper extracted from the Lake Superior mines appears to far exceed what can be accounted for in the North American archaeological record. Where did the copper go? This is not a fringe question. It is a question that professional archaeologists have raised, and the honest answer is that it is not fully resolved. The copper that went into Hopewell burial mounds is a fraction of what was extracted. Some was certainly traded along the Hopewell interaction sphere and is buried in contexts we have not yet found. But the quantities are large enough that some researchers have proposed that some of it left North America entirely. The hypothesis that pre-Columbian copper from Lake Superior ended up in Europe, traded across the Atlantic by mechanisms that the conventional model says did not exist, is not accepted in mainstream archaeology. But it is not entirely without circumstantial support. Bronze Age Europe had a flourishing copper-based metallurgy and extensive trading networks. The time period of the Lake Superior copper extraction peaks overlaps with the European Bronze Age in a way that is at least interesting, and some researchers have pointed to linguistic and genetic evidence for transatlantic contact in this period that has not been definitively refuted. The reason this matters for the story of British aristocratic wealth is precisely because the lost civilization framework served specific economic and political interests. If the mound builders were a vanished civilization unrelated to the current indigenous people, then there was no living claimant to the cultural heritage of the mounds, no community whose relationship to the landscape needed to be taken seriously as a legal or moral impediment to the transfer of that landscape into British and later American ownership. The ideological work of erasing the connection between living indigenous people and their archaeological heritage was done in service of the economic interests of the families who were acquiring that heritage's territory. And some of those families had names that echo through this entire story. The Virginia land speculators of the 18th century, whose investments in Ohio Valley land eventually generated the legal and military conflicts that produced both the American Revolution and the subsequent dispossession of indigenous peoples from the Ohio Valley, were drawing on capital that traced back through the Virginia planter class to the colonial investment networks of the 17th century, which themselves drew on the British aristocratic and merchant capital that had funded the original colonial enterprise. The Ohio Company of Virginia had investors that read like a directory of the Virginian planter class at its most ambitious. Lawrence Washington, George Washington's older brother, was among the incorporators. The Fairfax family, who held the Northern Neck Proprietary, covering millions of acres, were connected to the same network. The young George Washington worked as a surveyor for the Fairfax interests before he became a revolutionary. His work was literal, going out into the landscape that was being claimed and measured and mapped and translated into parcels that could be described in legal instruments. The same process, the translation of living landscape into abstract property, that had been applied to England through enclosure and to Ireland through plantation, was being applied to North America through survey. George Washington's land speculation in the Ohio Valley was not a peripheral activity. He acquired tens of thousands of acres of western land, and the legal complications surrounding that land, which had been surveyed and claimed in ways that the British government's 1763 proclamation line forbade, were among the grievances that turned him from a loyal British subject into a revolutionary. The money that funded the colonial system, the British aristocratic capital that had made the Virginia planter class possible, created the conditions for its own supersession when the colonial economy became large enough to resent the controls that the metropolitan power attempted to impose on it. History is always written by someone, and it is always written in service of someone's interests, even when the writer believes themselves to be completely objective. The historians who developed the lost civilization theory of the mound builders were not, in most cases, consciously fabricating history in service of economic interests. They were doing what educated people do when they encounter evidence that does not fit their existing framework. They were generating alternative explanations that preserved the framework. The framework was the one that made British and American land acquisition in North America seem legitimate, and the people whose interests were served by that framework were the same families whose wealth and whose political power we have been tracing through this story. Let us come back to the question that began this inquiry. Where did the money actually go? The families who controlled Britain before the royal family, in its modern form, settled into its current role. The great Whig aristocrats and the post-Reformation gentry and the merchant princes and the colonial investors had money in several different forms by the late 19th century, when the processes of aristocratic decline began to accelerate. They had agricultural land, which was becoming less valuable as American grain flooded the British market and agricultural rents collapsed. They had urban land, particularly in London, which was becoming vastly more valuable as the city continued to expand. They had investments in financial instruments, in railway stocks, in industrial enterprises. They had cultural assets, the great houses with their art collections, which were illiquid but enormously valuable. And they had human capital, the social connections, the educational credentials from institutions that existed, partly to reproduce the social advantages of families like theirs, the access to networks of political and commercial influence that money alone could not buy, but that money had originally created. The 20th century forced a reallocation. The agricultural land was mostly sold, either to sitting tenants under the various land reform measures that successive governments passed, or on the open market to new buyers who included urban professionals, institutional investors, and eventually the various overseas buyers who began entering the British land market in the second half of the century. Some of the great houses followed the land into different ownership, converted to institutional uses, schools, hotels, care homes, or transferred to the National Trust under arrangements that allowed the original family to continue living there while the maintenance costs were socialised. The urban land, particularly in London, was retained wherever possible, and its retention has been extraordinarily valuable. The families that held London property through the 20th century have seen their wealth grow in ways that would have been unimaginable even to their Victorian predecessors. The Grosvenor Estates holdings in Mayfair and Belgravia, the Portman family's holdings in Marylebone, the Howard de Walden estate in Fitzrovia, the Cadogan family's holdings in Chelsea, all of these represent concentrations of urban property wealth that have grown faster than almost any other asset class over the past 50 years. The financial investments were diversified and in many cases moved offshore. The sophisticated use of trusts, particularly Jersey trusts and later other offshore structures, allowed the transfer of wealth between generations to occur in ways that minimized inheritance taxes. The British system of inheritance, which has periodically attempted to redistribute concentrated wealth through taxation and has periodically been circumvented through legal structures, is a running negotiation between the state's interest in redistribution and the wealthy families' interest in preservation, and the families have generally had the better lawyers. Some of the money went into philanthropy, either genuine or tax-motivated or both, and the philanthropic institutions founded by the great British families, the charitable trusts and educational foundations and cultural institutions, represent a significant proportion of Britain's cultural infrastructure. The British Museum, founded in 1753, largely through the collection of Hans Sloane, whose collection was purchased for the nation after his death, with money partly derived from Jamaican slavery. The Tate Galleries, founded on money from Henry Tate, the sugar refinery magnate, sugar money having obvious connections to the plantation economy. The Courtauld Gallery, built on textile manufacturing wealth. The Wallace Collection, assembled by the Marquesses of Hertford from fortunes that included significant American connections. The cultural institutions are a physical form of the money after its conversion, and some of the money went into politics. Not in the crude direct way of the pocketborough era, but in the more diffuse and harder to trace way of political donations, of funding the educational institutions that produce politicians, of maintaining the networks of social connection through which political influence flows, of ownership and influence over media organizations. The relationship between aristocratic and landed wealth and the Conservative Party in Britain has been one of the most durable political alignments in democratic history, not because the families in question are ideologically committed to any particular vision of society, but because the Conservative Party has, with occasional exceptions, been reliably less interested in taxing accumulated wealth than its alternatives. The Blair government's removal of the hereditary peers from the House of Lords in 1999 was a significant symbolic moment, ending the automatic right of peers to sit in Parliament that had existed in some form since the Magna Carta era. But it was a much less significant practical moment than its symbolic weight might suggest. The families whose ancestors had sat in the Lords lost a formal political mechanism, but they retained the informal mechanisms, the wealth, the social connections, the cultural capital, the access to media, the educational advantages that perpetuate elite status across generations, even in the absence of formal hereditary privilege. The persistence of elite families across generations, even through periods of apparent democratization, is one of the most robust findings of social mobility research. A study published in 2014 by the sociologist Gregory Clark, who analyzed the persistence of elite surnames in different countries over multiple centuries, found that social mobility is far lower in all societies than commonly supposed, and that family advantage is transmitted across generations through mechanisms that operate even when specific assets, like titles or estates, are removed. The informal transmission of advantage through cultural knowledge, through social networks, through expectations and habits, and the intangible qualities that elite families reproduce in their children is more durable than any specific asset. The families who controlled Britain before the royal family solidified into its modern ceremonial role are still present. The surnames are still there in the law firms and the financial institutions and the charitable foundations and the educational establishments. The land is still concentrated, though the names on the deeds have sometimes changed. The money is in different forms and different places than it was in 1750 or 1850, but the logic of its accumulation and protection is recognizably continuous. There is a strange and somewhat haunting quality to the landscape of Britain once you understand what you are looking at. Every country house and every ancient church and every city square and every piece of parkland is a monument to a specific history of accumulation and dispossession and transfer. The parkland around the great houses was created by the enclosure movement, by the removal of common land from common use, and its conversion into private aesthetic space for the benefit of families wealthy enough to commission Capability Brown or Humphrey Repton to redesign it. The very beauty of the English countryside, the thing that makes it so appealing to tourists and so marketable in the heritage economy, is in large part the product of a specific historical process of wealth concentration. The grand houses themselves are almost never as old as they look. What appears to be a 16th century mansion is usually a 17th or 18th century rebuild on a site that may have earlier origins, but whose current form reflects the taste and the ambitions of a family that built it at a specific moment of peak wealth. The aged stone and the ancient oaks and the portraits of ancestors in the long gallery are all carefully assembled symbols of continuity in the service of legitimating a position that was in most cases much more recently acquired than the symbols suggest. This is not unique to Britain. All aristocracies do something similar. The Italian palazzo families and the French chateau families and the German Schloss families all engage in the same process of manufacturing antiquity in service of present advantage. But Britain has been extraordinarily good at it, perhaps better than anywhere else, and the cultural industries that have grown up around British heritage, the tourist economy, the period drama, the popular history publishing, the genealogy industry, are all participating in the ongoing manufacture of the narrative that makes the surviving concentrations of wealth seem natural and inevitable, and deeply rooted in a specific soil, rather than contingent and recent and internationally mobile. The reality is that the wealthiest British families are now primarily participants in global capital markets, rather than specifically British landowners. The Duke of Westminster's wealth, to return to the most prominent example, is managed through Grosvenor Group, a private company with a diverse international real estate portfolio that extends far beyond Mayfair and Belgravia into commercial property in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Asia. And the Cavendish family's Chatsworth estate is a remarkable heritage business, but it is the Cavendish family's involvement in financial services and other sectors through various vehicles that represents the majority of their current wealth. The families that have maintained their position have done so by globalizing, by moving their wealth into forms and structures that are not dependent on any specific piece of English land or any specific British political arrangement. This globalization of British aristocratic capital is continuous with the original colonial project in a structural, if not a personal sense. The families who funded the original colonization of North America were doing what their descendants are still doing, looking for returns that exceed what the domestic economy can offer, moving capital into frontier opportunities, using financial instruments and legal structures to extract value from places and people at a distance. The specific geography has changed. The mechanism has not. The pre-Columbian societies of North America that the British colonial enterprise displaced, the Mississippian city builders, the Hopewell astronomers and traders, the Adena mound constructors, the dozens of other distinct cultural traditions that left their traces in the landscape, were themselves participants in continental-scale exchange systems that moved material and ideas across enormous distances. They were not isolated primitives. They were sophisticated participants in networks of exchange that in some respects resembled, in structure, if not in scale, the trading networks of the Old World. What the British families did to those networks was not simply to displace them. It was to replace them with a different kind of network, one in which the direction of value transfer was consistently outward, from the land to the colonizers, from the labor of the dispossessed to the capital of the possessors, from the accumulated knowledge and relationship to the landscape that indigenous people represented to the abstract legal instruments that the colonial system substituted for it. The loss was not just territorial, it was epistemological, a loss of ways of knowing and relating to a specific place that cannot be replaced by any amount of compensation money. The knowledge that the mound builders encoded in their earthworks, the astronomical understanding, the cosmological framework, the relationship to specific places and their specific qualities, was in the process of being transmitted to descendants when the colonial disruption interrupted it. Some of it survived. Indigenous nations in the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi drainage maintain oral traditions and ceremonial practices that connect to the mound builder heritage, even when the specific knowledge of the mounds was disrupted by removal and forced relocation. The Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the 5 civilized tribes from their southeastern homelands to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, was in part a removal from the landscapes that these tribes had inhabited and managed and understood for millennia, a break in the relationship between people and place that the colonial system deliberately created. President Jackson, who signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, was a Tennessee land speculator before he was a general and before he was president. The removal of the Cherokee and the Creek and the Chickasaw and the Choctaw and the Seminole freed up millions of acres of land in the southeast for the expansion of plantation agriculture worked by enslaved people. The economic chain from British colonial investment to American plantation economy to the dispossession of indigenous peoples to the expansion of the plantation system that generated the wealth that would eventually flow back through various channels into the British financial system is not a simple chain, but it is a real one. It is the families who profited at each link of that chain were not all British aristocrats. Many were American, and the American planter class was in some respects more autonomous from its British origins by the early 19th century than it had been at the time of the Revolution. But the financial infrastructure within which all of this operated, the banks and the insurance companies and the shipping networks and the commodity markets, was still predominantly British in its orientation, still largely centered on London, still largely run by the descendants of the families this story has been following. The Baring family provides a case study in how British financial power mediated between the aristocratic wealth we have been examining and the American economic development that was transforming the continent. Francis Baring, the founder, was a Devon merchant's son who built a banking house that became arguably the most important financial institution in the world in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His clients included the British government, multiple European states, and the government of the new United States of America. His sons and grandsons were integrated into the British aristocracy through marriage and title acquisition. By the early 19th century, the Barings had become something that was simultaneously a commercial enterprise and an aristocratic dynasty, a combination that was entirely characteristic of the way British elite society worked. The Barings financed the purchase of Louisiana. They financed various aspects of American infrastructure development. They were involved in the financial arrangements around British investment in American railroads. The money that moved through Baring Brothers connected the capital, accumulated by British landowning and colonial families, to the economic development of the American continent, including the development of territories that had been the homeland of pre-Columbian civilizations, within living memory of some of the people involved. The specific geography of American railroad development in the 19th century is not random. The railroads followed specific corridors through the landscape, and those corridors were often determined by a combination of topography and the location of resources that were valuable for extraction: coal and iron ore and timber and agricultural land, and the existing patterns of settlement and land ownership. The land grants that accompanied railroad construction Millions of acres given to the railroad companies by the federal government to incentivize construction were themselves a mechanism for the final transfer of the Trans-Mississippi West into private ownership. And the beneficiaries included not only the American railroad promoters, but the British investors, who held significant portions of the equity. The British investment in American land and railroads in the second half of the 19th century was so large that it provoked a nativist political backlash. The alien property restriction movements of the 1880s, which resulted in legislation limiting foreign land ownership in some territories. The British noble families who had been quietly accumulating western ranches and farms, the Dundas family's investments in Montana cattle ranches, the Scottish investment syndicates that held Wyoming and Dakota cattle land, the various aristocratic individuals who had bought ranches in the American West as a combination of investment and romantic adventure, were eventually curtailed by this political reaction, though not before they had profited substantially from the development phase. But the story of British aristocratic investment in America in this period is not only a story of economic exploitation, it is also a story of cultural transfer that had lasting effects on both sides of the Atlantic. The British families who invested in American railroads and ranches brought with them not only capital, but specific ideas about land ownership, about the relationship between landlord and tenant, about the use of legal instruments to protect concentrated wealth, that shaped the development of American property law and American agricultural systems in ways that are still visible. The idea that land should be privately owned in fee simple, that the owner of the surface also owns the mineral rights below and the air rights above, that land can be bought and sold as a commodity without any enduring relationship between the land and specific people, is a specifically British legal inheritance that was transplanted to America and that differs in important ways from the property concepts of both continental European law and of the indigenous cultures that preceded European settlement. The British common law approach to land ownership is not the only possible approach. It is one specific cultural and legal tradition, and its global dominance reflects the global dominance of the economic and military system that carried it. There is a contrast worth drawing here between the British legal tradition of land ownership and the property concepts that some of the pre-Columbian cultures of North America appear to have operated under, at least in the accounts that survive through indigenous oral traditions and in the archaeological record. The Hopewell exchange system, which moved materials across a continent through networks that appear to have been based on ceremonial exchange rather than commercial trade in the modern sense, operated on a logic in which the value of an object was inseparable from the social relationship in which it was exchanged. A copper ornament was not simply worth its material value, plus its labor value. It was worth the relationship it represented, the connection between distant communities, the obligations it created, the cosmological significance attached to the specific materials and forms. This is not a primitive or naive economic system. It is a sophisticated one, but it is organized around fundamentally different principles than those of the British commercial capitalism that eventually replaced it. The British system saw land and resources as commodities to be owned and traded. The Hopewell system saw exchange as a social and spiritual relationship that maintained the connections between communities and between the human world and the wider cosmos. The differences are not merely technical. They reflect different fundamental assumptions about what the natural world is and what humans are for. The replacement of one system with another was not a peaceful or voluntary process. It required military force, legal instruments that the conquered people were not asked to validate, and an ideological framework that denied the legitimacy of the existing systems. The families who profited from that replacement, both the British families we have been examining and their American successors, were not simply economic actors operating in a neutral market. They were participants in a specific civilizational project with specific beneficiaries and specific losers. Understanding this does not require villainizing the individuals involved. Most of them were doing what their cultural training had prepared them to do, operating within systems that had been constructed over generations to make wealth extraction seem natural and legitimate. But understanding it does require acknowledging that the wealth we are examining, the wealth that built the country houses and endowed the cultural institutions and funded the parliamentary careers and created the financial infrastructure of the modern world, had specific costs that were paid by specific people who did not choose to pay them. The specific mysteries of pre-Columbian North America are still being excavated and still generating surprises that challenge the conventional narrative. The ancient city of Cahokia, which we mentioned earlier, is still only partially excavated. The surviving mound complex, which is in the floodplain of the Mississippi, just east of St. Louis, represents only a fraction of the original city. The urban area extended over an enormous territory, with neighborhoods and satellite mounds and agricultural fields and waterways that are now covered by the suburban sprawl of the St. Louis metropolitan area. The archaeological work that has been done at Cahokia reveals a society of extraordinary complexity. There are neighborhoods that appear to have housed craft specialists. There are areas that appear to have served as markets or redistribution centers. The central Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico, rises about 100 feet and covers an area of 15 acres at its base. The construction of Monk's Mound, which was built in multiple stages over several centuries, required the movement of an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth. This is not the work of a simple society. It is the work of a state, or something functionally equivalent to a state. The governance system of Cahokia is still not fully understood. There is evidence that power was concentrated in ways that made significant demands on the surrounding population, demands that may have contributed to the social stresses that eventually led to the city's decline. The archaeological record shows evidence of large-scale feasting, which in the archaeological literature is often an indicator of elite redistribution, a way of maintaining social cohesion and political loyalty through the conspicuous sharing of food. There is also evidence of what appears to have been human sacrifice, which is one of the more disturbing discoveries of Cahokia archaeology, with mass burials of young women in apparent ritual contexts associated with the burial of high-status individuals. Cahokia was not a peaceful paradise. It was a complex, stratified society with hierarchies and conflicts and ritualized violence, as well as long-distance trade and sophisticated engineering. But its complexity is precisely what makes it so important for understanding pre-Columbian North America, and so inconvenient for the ideological framework that the British colonizers and their successors needed to maintain. The archaeology of the American Southeast, the territory of what became the Plantation South, reveals a similar complexity. The Mississippian cultures that were present across this region when the Spanish first encountered them in the 16th century were highly organized chiefdoms or states with complex political hierarchies, large sedentary populations, and sophisticated agricultural systems. Hernando de Soto's expedition across the southeast from 1539 to 1542 was moving through a politically organized landscape, dealing with chiefs and confederacies and the kinds of diplomatic challenges that only arise when the people you are trying to conquer have their own state systems. The collapse of these Mississippian polities in the century or so between de Soto's expedition and the first substantial British colonial presence in the southeast is one of the great demographic disasters in human history. The diseases that European contact introduced, smallpox, measles, influenza, operated ahead of the settlers themselves, moving along the existing trade and communication networks of the Mississippian system and killing populations that had no immunity to them before any European had set foot in many of the affected areas. Estimates of indigenous population decline in the century after first contact range from 50% to 90% in different regions. The landscape that British colonial settlers entered was not the same landscape that de Soto had moved through. It was already a post-catastrophe landscape, the surviving populations trying to reorganize in the wake of a demographic crisis that had destroyed the civilizations their grandparents had known. The British colonizers did not cause the initial epidemic collapse, though they certainly accelerated and extended it as they moved into the continent. But they benefited from it enormously, and the benefit was not incidental. The empty or depopulated landscapes that the epidemic had created were the landscapes that the colonial enterprise was able to occupy, with relatively little military resistance in many areas. The labor of clearing forests and building farms and extracting resources fell on enslaved Africans rather than on the indigenous people, who were too few and too scattered to be organized into a controlled labor force in most of the southeast. This substitution, the replacement of indigenous land knowledge and labor with African enslaved labor on land from which the original inhabitants had been cleared, is one of the most consequential economic arrangements in history, and the profits from it flowed directly into the British families and British financial institutions that this story has been examining. The tobacco that grew in Virginia and Maryland on land that Powhatan Confederacy members had recently vacated. The rice that grew in South Carolina on land that had been the territory of the Yamasee people before the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717. The cotton that eventually covered the Southeast, grown by enslaved people on land from which the Cherokee and Creek and Choctaw had been forcibly removed. All of this production was the feedstock for the British commercial and financial system. And the ideological framework that made this all possible, the simultaneous denial of indigenous civilization and the denial of enslaved people's humanity, was not a coincidence or an oversight. It was a necessary condition for the profitability of the entire enterprise. If the indigenous people were recognized as the sophisticated, organized, historically embedded societies that they were, the legal basis for taking their land was considerably weaker. If the enslaved people were recognized as the fully human beings they were, the economic basis for the plantation system collapsed entirely. The ideological work of dehumanization was not a side effect of the economic system. It was one of its essential inputs. The families that profited from the system, and we have been naming them throughout this story, the great Whig aristocrats, the colonial investors, the plantation owners, the banking families that financed the trade, were not incapable of recognizing the humanity of the people they were profiting from. Many of them knew perfectly well what they were doing and preferred not to dwell on it. Others constructed elaborate philosophical frameworks to justify it. A few, like the Quaker abolitionists or the founders of the anti-slavery movement, who were often nonconformist religious communities with their own reasons for opposing the Anglican establishment, opposed it from the beginning. But the opposition was for a long time insufficient to overcome the weight of the economic interest, and even when abolition was eventually achieved in 1833, it was achieved in a form that protected the economic interests of the slaveholders, the £20 million in compensation, rather than addressing the interests of the people who had actually been enslaved. The mysteries of the pre-Columbian Americas run deeper than the mound builders of the Ohio Valley and the Mississippian chiefdoms of the Southeast. The further you look into the archaeological and archaeoastronomical record, the more complex and in many ways the more puzzling the picture becomes. The Chaco Canyon complex in what is now northwestern New Mexico is one of the most extraordinary sites in North American archaeology and one of the most debated. The great houses, Pueblo Bonito, Chetroquetl, Pueblo del Arroyo, were built by the ancestral Puebloan people, also known by the Navajo term Anasazi, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE. Pueblo Bonito is an enormous D-shaped structure, 4 stories tall, containing over 600 rooms, built from precisely cut and fitted sandstone masonry to standards that are strikingly high, even by modern architectural assessment. The alignments at Chaco are remarkable. The major great houses are oriented to the cardinal directions with precision that must have required astronomical observation. A system of roads connects the canyon complex to outlier communities over a geographic area of hundreds of miles. Roads that are almost perfectly straight, cut through the desert landscape without the organic curves that most road systems develop to follow terrain. Roads that are sometimes too wide and too carefully engineered for the practical demands of pedestrian and llama-based transport. The roads appear to be primarily ceremonial or cosmological in their function, alignments on the landscape rather than purely practical infrastructure. The turquoise at Chaco, of which enormous quantities have been found in ritual deposits, came from specific mines that were controlled and managed, not simply gathered opportunistically. The macaws, the scarlet macaws whose remains have been found in Chaco and whose feathers were clearly important for ritual purposes, came from Mesoamerica, hundreds of miles to the south. The chocolate residue found in ceramic vessels at Chaco represents another connection to Mesoamerican trade networks. Chaco was not isolated. It was a node in a wide-ranging exchange and communication system that connected the southwest to Mexico and to the broader pre-Columbian world. The collapse of the Chaco system around 1150 CE, followed by the broader abandonment of the Four Corners region by 1300 CE, is another of those great prehistoric mysteries that have not been fully resolved. Climate change and extended drought in the late 12th and 13th centuries clearly played a role. Social stress and possibly conflict also contributed, but the specific timing and the specific mechanisms are still debated, and the scale of the demographic reorganization that occurred, entire populations moving from regions they had occupied for centuries to new locations, represents a human story of considerable complexity and difficulty. The descendants of the people who built Chaco Canyon are still present in the Southwest, in the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona. The Hopi and the Zuni, and the various Rio Grande Pueblo communities, all maintain oral traditions and ceremonial practices that connect to the ancestral Puebloan heritage, though the specific connections and the specific knowledge vary by community and are not always shared with outsiders, for entirely understandable reasons given the history of what happened when indigenous knowledge was shared with European researchers. The Navajo and Apache peoples, who arrived in the Southwest somewhat later than the Pueblo communities, have their own pre-Columbian heritage and their own specific relationships to the landscape that are distinct from the Pueblo tradition, but equally deep. The Diné, as the Navajo call themselves, maintain a cosmological relationship to the specific landscape of the Four Corners region that is encoded in their sacred geography. The four sacred mountains that define the boundaries of Diné-Bikéya, the Navajo homeland. This relationship to specific places, this understanding that particular peaks and canyons and rivers are not merely natural features, but sacred presences with their own significance in the cosmological order, represents a way of knowing the land that is categorically different from the British property law tradition that eventually displaced it. The British families who acquired interests in the Southwest in the late 19th century, mining interests, ranching interests, railroad interests, were operating entirely within the British property law tradition. They saw the landscape as a collection of resources with specific monetary values that could be extracted, and they used the legal instruments of the American state, which had inherited the British common law tradition, to establish and protect their claims to those resources. The specific cosmological and ceremonial significance of the landscape to the people who had lived in it for centuries was legally irrelevant. The Navajo Long Walk of 1864 to 1868, during which the Navajo were forcibly removed from their homeland to the Bosque Redondo Reservation in eastern New Mexico in a process that killed thousands, was the culmination of a process that began with the assertion of American sovereign authority over the Southwest following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. The transfer of sovereignty was accompanied by a transfer of legal authority that replaced Navajo and Apache legal traditions with American law, and American law was built on the same British common law foundations that had justified the earlier colonial dispossessions in the East. The money trail connects here in ways that are indirect but real. The capital that funded the American military operations in the Southwest came from the same federal government that was borrowing from British financial institutions. The railroad construction that opened the Southwest to economic exploitation was funded by British investors as well as American ones. The copper and silver and other minerals extracted from the Southwest enriched shareholders in companies that were listed on the London Stock Exchange as well as on American exchanges. The financial integration of the Anglo-American economic system meant that the extraction of value from the Southwest was, ultimately, a shared enterprise between British and American capital, even when the physical and legal operations were conducted entirely by American institutions. And the great British mining families who operated in the American West, the families behind the Rio Tinto Company, founded as a British enterprise to work Spanish copper deposits, but eventually with extensive American interests. The Consolidated Gold Fields, The various British American mining syndicates that operated across the western states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these were the descendant institutions of the same colonial enterprise that had begun with the Virginia Company and the East India Company. The logic was continuous, even when the specific mechanisms changed. Capital pools in London, capital deployed in resource-rich territory at a distance. Profits extracted and returned to London. Losses socialized through various mechanisms. The specific territory changes from the Caribbean to the American Southeast, to the American West, to Australia to Africa, and back again. But the pattern is remarkably consistent. There is a specific thread in this story that deserves particular attention, and that is the question of what the British families and their American counterparts understood about what they were doing to pre-Columbian sites and pre-Columbian knowledge. Because the answer is complicated and surprising, some of the most significant work on understanding pre-Columbian American civilizations was done by people who were simultaneously participants in the colonial and extractive enterprise that was destroying those civilizations. Ephraim George Squire, the co-author of Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was also an American diplomat who spent time in Central America and later in Peru, where he made significant observations of Inca and pre-Inca sites. His scientific curiosity about pre-Columbian civilization coexisted with his participation in the political and economic systems that were displacing those civilizations' living descendants. John Wesley Powell, the director of the Bureau of Ethnology, was also the director of the United States Geological Survey, the institution responsible for surveying and mapping the public domain, the lands that were in the process of being transferred from indigenous to non-indigenous ownership. His scientific work on the languages and cultures and physical remains of indigenous peoples went on simultaneously with his institutional role in facilitating the transfer of their ancestral territories into the American property system. This is not hypocrisy, exactly. It is the normal condition of people who are embedded in systems that contain contradictions. They lack either the motivation or the mechanism to resolve. The families we have been examining throughout this story were, many of them, capable of considerable cultural sophistication and genuine interest in the history and cultures of the people. Their economic activities were displacing. The same planters who had their West Indian plantations worked by enslaved people also wrote natural history essays and collected specimens for the British Museum. The same railroad financiers who were opening the American West to exploitation also collected Native American artifacts and funded the anthropologists who documented vanishing cultures. The collecting is itself significant. The great British collections of indigenous American material, now housed in the British Museum and the Pitt Rivers Museum and the National Museum of Scotland and dozens of other institutions, were assembled largely in the period of colonial expansion. The objects, the baskets, and the pottery, and the ceremonial regalia, and the human remains that ended up in these collections were removed from their communities of origin through a variety of mechanisms, some involving purchase, some involving theft, some involving the exploitation of desperate circumstances in which indigenous communities sold or traded objects of great cultural significance because they needed food or money to survive. The repatriation of these objects is one of the live ethical and political debates of the current moment, and it connects directly to the broader question of what reckoning, if any, is required for the chain of wealth extraction and cultural destruction that this story has been describing. The British Museum's refusal to return the Elgin marbles to Greece is the most famous instance of this debate, but the question of indigenous American material in British collections is equally live, and the sums of money and the scale of cultural significance involved are, if anything, larger. The Kennewick Man controversy, which ran from the discovery of ancient human remains in Washington state in 1996 through the eventual repatriation of those remains to local tribal nations in 2017, illustrates the complexity of the questions involved. The remains, approximately 9,000 years old, were initially claimed by scientists who wanted to study them and by various Native American tribes who claimed them as ancestral. The legal and ethical dispute touched on fundamental questions about who has the right to the physical remains of ancient Americans. What relationship between living people and ancient remains is sufficient to constitute cultural affiliation, and what the purposes and priorities of archaeology are when it operates in territories that are also the homelands of living communities with their own relationships to the past. These questions are not resolved, and their irresolution is partly a function of the history this story has been tracing. If the history of British and American property law had been different, if the indigenous people of North America had maintained legal and political standing sufficient to protect their interests in the material remains of their ancestors, the Kennewick Man controversy would have been resolved differently from the start. The legal framework that made the dispute possible, the framework in which ancient remains in American territory were initially treated as potential scientific resources rather than as the ancestors of living people, was the legal framework created by the same colonial enterprise that dispossessed those people of their land. Let us return now to the British families themselves, and specifically to the question of what happened to the money in the most recent period, the period since the Second World War. Because this is the period in which the transformation of British aristocratic wealth has been most dramatic, and in which the connections between British old money and global financial structures have become most visible. The great levelling that many people expected the welfare state and the progressive taxation of the post-war decades to produce did not actually occur, or rather, it occurred in some ways, but not others. The average standard of living in Britain rose dramatically between 1945 and 1975. The gap in life expectancy, educational attainment, and material conditions between the working class and the middle class narrowed substantially. But the gap between the very wealthy and everyone else narrowed much less than the general picture suggests, and in some respects did not narrow at all. The reason is the offshore trust and the private company and the family office and the various other legal structures that the wealthiest families used to maintain the value of their wealth in a period of high taxation. The top marginal income tax rate in Britain reached 98% on investment income in the 1970s. Death duties at their peak were intended to be genuinely redistributive, but the families with the most wealth and the best lawyers and accountants were the families best positioned to use the legal structures that minimize the impact of those taxes. The nominal rate was very high. The effective rate paid by the wealthiest was often much lower. The offshore trust structure that many British aristocratic families use is not complicated in its basic logic. Assets are transferred into a trust located in a favourable tax jurisdiction. The trust is technically owned by the trustees rather than by any individual beneficiary, so the beneficiaries who receive income from the trust are not subject to the taxes that would apply if they owned the assets directly. The arrangement is entirely legal and entirely designed to defeat the redistributive purpose of inheritance taxation. The Channel Islands, particularly Jersey, became important centres for these structures in the post-war decades because of their specific constitutional position. Jersey is a Crown dependency, not part of the UK, but under the protection of the British Crown. Its financial law is distinct from UK law, and for decades it has offered legal stability, English language tradition, proximity to London, and low taxation that makes it attractive for exactly these kinds of wealth management structures. The Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, all Crown dependencies or British overseas territories, serve similar functions for larger and more internationally mobile pools of wealth. The British imperial system, even after its formal dissolution, left behind a network of small jurisdictions that maintained useful legal characteristics while offering regulatory and tax environments favourable to the mobile wealth of international elites. The sun has set on the British Empire in the sense that Britain no longer governs India or Nigeria or Canada, but the infrastructure of jurisdictions and legal systems that the empire created continues to shape global finance in ways specifically beneficial to the kinds of wealth that the families in this story hold. The private equity revolution of the 1980s and 1990s gave British aristocratic capital new vehicles. The buyout funds and venture capital funds that proliferated in this period allowed wealth that had previously been held in land or company shares to be invested in diversified, actively managed portfolios generating returns exceeding those of any single asset class. The family offices managing the wealth of the wealthiest British families are sophisticated investment operations that rival mid-size investment management firms in their access to information and their ability to invest across geographies. The question of what obligations attach to this wealth is one the families in question mostly prefer not to address directly. The philanthropic foundations and charitable trusts serve both genuine social purposes and the purpose of demonstrating that the wealth benefits society in ways that reduce political pressure for redistribution. But the cultural acknowledgement of history is not the same as accountability for its consequences. Donating a house to the National Trust does not change the history of how the money that built the house was generated. Endowing a library at Oxford does not constitute a reckoning with the plantation profits that paid for the endowment. The forbidden history of pre-Columbian North America is forbidden not because it is hidden in vaults or suppressed by shadowy organizations, though there have been specific instances of suppression and misrepresentation that deserve examination. It is forbidden in the broader and more important sense that it is systematically undervalued and underexplored in the educational and cultural systems of the societies that inherited the colonial project. Children in American and British schools learn very little about the civilizational complexity of pre-Columbian North America. They learn nothing about Cahokia in most cases. They learn nothing about the Hopewell interaction sphere or the precision astronomy of the Newark earthworks. They learn that there were Native Americans who were hunter-gatherers or occasionally farmers and who were displaced by European settlement in a narrative that is thin enough to prevent any serious engagement with what was actually lost. This thinness is not neutral. It serves specific purposes for specific interests. If the pre-Columbian history of North America is rich and complex, if the societies that preceded European settlement were sophisticated enough to build cities and conduct long-distance astronomy and maintain continental trade networks, then the displacement of those societies requires more justification than the simple narrative of progress, of civilization coming to a land that lacked it. The thin narrative is ideologically convenient in ways that connects directly to the economic interests of the families and institutions that benefit from the current land tenure arrangements. The specific archaeological discoveries that have done most to challenge the thin narrative have sometimes met resistance that goes beyond normal scientific skepticism. The dating of evidence for early human presence in the Americas is one arena where the resistance to paradigm-challenging evidence has sometimes been notable. The Clovis first theory, which held that the first Americans arrived around 13,000 years ago via the Bering Land Bridge and spread rapidly southward, dominated American archaeology for decades. Evidence for earlier arrivals, from sites like Monteverde in Chile or the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, was contested with unusual intensity before being gradually accepted. The possibility that the Americas were first settled considerably earlier than 13,000 years ago, perhaps as early as 130,000 years ago, if the Cerruti Mastodon site in California is correctly interpreted, is still highly controversial. Most archaeologists regard the very early dates with great skepticism, but the history of the field suggests that paradigm-challenging evidence in American archaeology tends to meet resistance that is not always purely empirical, and that the timeline for acceptance of new findings is sometimes longer than the purely scientific merits of the evidence would predict. This is not to say that all claims for very early American habitation are correct. The evidence is genuinely contested, and contested evidence should be contested. But it is worth noting that the ideological investments in specific versions of American prehistory are large, and that those investments do not always operate transparently in the evaluation of evidence. The question of pre-Columbian contact between Europe and the Americas is similarly contested in ways that are not always purely about the evidence. The claim that Bronze Age Europeans or Phoenician traders or medieval Templar knights or Welsh princes reached North America before Columbus is one that has attracted both serious researchers and committed cranks in roughly equal measure, and the mixture of legitimate inquiry with obvious fantasy has made it difficult to evaluate the legitimate inquiries on their merits. What can be said, based on the evidence, is that the idea of pre-Columbian contact is not inherently absurd, and that the specific contacts that are documented, Norse contact around 1000 CE, Polynesian contact with South America sometime before European arrival, suggest that the Atlantic and Pacific were not impenetrable barriers to pre-Columbian navigation. Whether further contacts occurred, and if so what their consequences were, is a question that deserves serious investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. The British families who funded the colonial enterprise that eventually resulted in the comprehensive study and systematization of pre-Columbian American archaeology were not interested in promoting a more complex understanding of pre-Columbian civilization. They had, as we have seen, specific reasons to prefer the simpler version. But some of the researchers who worked within the institutions they funded did in fact produce work that challenged the simplifying narrative, and that work has gradually accumulated into a much richer picture of pre-Columbian North America than the one that the colonial ideological framework needed. The richness of that picture is still emerging. New LiDAR surveys, using airborne laser scanning to map terrain through forest cover, have revealed the full scale of Maya and other Mesoamerican urban systems in ways that were not possible with ground-based survey. Similar techniques are beginning to reveal the extent of earthwork systems in North America that were not visible from the ground. The picture of pre-Columbian North American civilization that is emerging from this work is genuinely surprising, even to specialists, revealing that the scale and complexity of organized human activity in the pre-contact period was considerably greater than the conventional models assumed. The implications for the history of British and American land tenure are not abstract. If the pre-Columbian landscape of North America was a managed, shaped, organized landscape rather than a wilderness, if the forests and grasslands and waterways were the product of active human management over millennia rather than purely natural systems, then the legal fictions that underlie the original land grants, the idea that the land was waste, unimproved, not subject to any legitimate prior claim, are even more clearly fictions than they were already understood to be. The specific management practices of pre-Columbian North American peoples have been most carefully studied in the context of indigenous fire management, the use of controlled burning to shape forest composition, maintain open grassland, promote the growth of food plants, and manage animal populations. The evidence that indigenous people actively managed the landscape through fire over thousands of years is now well established. The landscapes that European colonizers described as wilderness were in significant part the product of indigenous management practices that created the particular combinations of forest and grassland and edge habitat that made the continent's biodiversity so extraordinary. When the fires stopped, because the people who had set them were dead from disease or removed from the landscape changed. Forest succession proceeded without the periodic reset that fire had provided. The management of the American landscape by its original inhabitants was not incidental. It was the ecological basis of the landscape's productivity. The British families who acquired American land in the colonial period were acquiring not just territory, but the product of thousands of years of indigenous land management. The soil fertility of the colonial Southeast that made cotton and tobacco agriculture so productive had been built up over millennia of indigenous agricultural practices. The forest compositions of the colonial Northeast that provided timber for the colonial economy had been shaped by centuries of indigenous fire management. All of this accumulated ecological capital was transferred, along with the legal title to the land, into British and then American ownership, without any acknowledgement that it existed. The agricultural revolution of the colonial period was built on this ecological inheritance, and the fortunes that funded the British country houses and the London financial markets were built on the agricultural revolution. The chain from pre-Columbian land management to aristocratic English estate is not metaphorical. It is a real chain of value transfer that can, with sufficient archival and archaeological work, be partially traced and partially quantified. The short answer to what the future holds is that it looks uncertain in ways the previous several centuries did not. The systems of legal and political protection, maintaining concentrated wealth, the property law, the offshore trust structures, The class-based educational and social systems that reproduced elite advantage are under more pressure than at any point since the Victorian era. Not from revolutionary politics, which has not materialized, but from the accumulation of institutional changes, from repatriation demands, from the reparations debates, from the gradual incorporation of more accurate histories of colonialism into public education, from the simply increasing visibility of the historical record that this kind of investigation makes accessible. None of this is certain to produce significant redistribution. The families have survived worse pressures before. The legal and political systems within which they operate were largely designed to protect their interests. But the pressure is not going away, and some changes being demanded are more structural than the legitimating narrative can absorb. But here is what is different now from all the previous moments of apparent pressure and apparent stability. The information environment has changed in ways that fundamentally alter the conditions under which narratives about wealth and legitimacy operate. The historical record that used to be accessible only to professional researchers with access to specialist archives is now increasingly available to anyone with an internet connection and sufficient curiosity. The Legacies of British Slavery database is publicly searchable. The records of the original colonial land grants are digitized and available. The archaeological publications that document the sophistication of pre-Columbian civilization are open access in ways that academic publications were not a generation ago. The genealogical databases that connect current wealthy families to their colonial and slave trading ancestors are more detailed and more accessible than they have ever been. This does not automatically produce redistribution. Information does not translate automatically into political will, and political will does not translate automatically into structural change. But it does change the conditions under which the legitimating narratives operate. It is much harder to maintain the narrative that British aristocratic wealth is simply the natural result of long-standing excellence and virtuous management when the specific mechanisms by which it was accumulated are documented in publicly accessible databases, and when the specific cost of those mechanisms to specific communities of people is clearly articulated. The royal family itself is the most visible instance of this changed information environment. The institution of the monarchy, which the families we have been examining, both served and used throughout this story, is facing questions about its historical relationship to slavery and colonialism that it has been able to avoid or to answer only in the most general terms throughout its previous history. The wealth of the Crown estate, the specific origins of specific royal residences, the connections between the House of Windsor's German ancestors and the colonial and slave-trading wealth of the families that supported their installation, these are questions that the information environment of the 21st century makes much more difficult to leave unaddressed than the information environment of the 20th century did. The families that controlled Britain before the royal family in its current form established itself in 1917, when the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha renamed itself Windsor in response to anti-German sentiment during the First World War, are still present. The change of name was itself a masterpiece of the kind of legitimating rebranding that the British establishment has always been extremely good at. The same institution, the same families around it, the same underlying economic relationships, presented under a new name that sounded more native and more natural than the German original. The Cecil family is still present. The current Marquess of Salisbury is a direct descendant of the William Cecil, whose career as Elizabeth I's chief minister began the family's rise to prominence 4.5 centuries ago. The Cavendish family is still present. The Grosvenors are still present. The Howard family, the Dukes of Norfolk, are still present and are still the hereditary Earl Marshal of England, responsible for organizing royal occasions, including coronations. The continuity is remarkable. The families that were powerful in Tudor England are, with exceptions and modifications, still the families that are powerful in 21st century Britain. But they are powerful in different ways and through different mechanisms than they were in Tudor England, or in Georgian England, or even in Victorian England. The specific mechanisms by which they exercise power have changed enormously. The direct purchase of parliamentary seats is impossible. The proprietary control of government appointments has been reduced, if not eliminated. The absolute property rights of the landlord over the tenant are constrained by legislation that would have been unthinkable to their ancestors. In these specific senses, the system is more democratic than it was. But the underlying structural advantage, the accumulated capital, the institutional connections, the cultural reproduction of elite status through the educational system, the legal structures that protect wealth across generations, these persist. And they persist in a form that is harder to challenge than the explicit privileges of the old system, precisely because they operate through apparently neutral mechanisms, through market processes and legal instruments and meritocratic-seeming competitions, rather than through the explicit assertion of hereditary right. This is the final sophistication of the system. The move from explicit hereditary privilege to implicit structural advantage is not a triumph of democracy. It is a more durable form of aristocratic power, because it is harder to identify, harder to articulate as unjust, and harder to remedy through the political mechanisms that democratization provides. You can abolish the rotten boroughs, you can make the reform of the hereditary peerage, but you cannot easily abolish the social capital that allows the children of the wealthy to outperform on the admissions tests for elite educational institutions, or the financial capital that allows the wealthy to employ the best lawyers when their property interests are at stake, or the legal capital accumulated in the trust structures and holding companies and offshore arrangements that maintain the value of inherited wealth across tax regimes and political transitions. The families who controlled Britain before the modern royal family exist in a zone of structural advantage that the history of 5 centuries of political change has made more durable, not less. The surface has changed entirely. The kings and queens are now ceremonial. The great aristocratic estates are often heritage businesses rather than working farms. The parliamentary boroughs are long gone. The slave trade is abolished. The formal empire has ended. But the wealth persists, in different forms and different places, still connected by chains of documentation and legal inheritance to the specific historical moments when it was extracted from specific people in specific places. And some of it is still moving, still crossing oceans, still finding new territories where the returns are higher than in the mature markets of Europe. The global real estate investments of the Grosvenor Group in American and Australian and Asian cities are one form of this continuing movement. The private equity investments of various aristocratic family offices in technology companies and infrastructure funds and emerging market assets are another. The offshore structures in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands that hold portions of these investments are another. The pre-Columbian civilizations of North America left their marks on the landscape in ways that are still being discovered and still being interpreted. The earthworks of the Ohio Valley are still there, though many have been ploughed under and paved over and built upon in the centuries since their builders left. The Great Mounds at Cahokia are a state historic site, visited by tourists who are mostly unaware of the significance of what they are seeing. The Newark earthworks in Newark, Ohio, are partly occupied by a golf course, an irony that various commentators have noted, but that has not yet produced a campaign sufficient to remove the golf course. The Serpent Mound is preserved and studied. Chaco Canyon is a national monument. The surviving earthworks of the Hopewell tradition in southern Ohio are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These designations are important. They represent a form of acknowledgement that something significant exists here and deserves protection and study, but they do not in themselves constitute a reckoning with the history of how these sites were treated, or with the history of the ideological frameworks that were used to misrepresent them, or with the economic interest that shaped those frameworks. They are the cultural acknowledgement that this story has been describing as insufficient on its own. The deeper reckoning, the one that would require acknowledging not just that pre-Columbian North American civilization was complex and significant, but that the transfer of its territory into European and American private ownership was a specific historical injustice, with specific beneficiaries and specific victims whose consequences persist in the present, is a much more demanding and much more threatening acknowledgement. It threatens not just the comfort of historical narrative, but the security of current property arrangements, and the families that hold those property arrangements have the resources and the institutional connections to resist the deeper reckoning while accepting the shallower one. Whether the deeper reckoning comes, and what form it takes if it does, is one of the genuinely open questions of the present moment in both Britain and North America. The political movements that have raised it most forcefully, the land back movement among indigenous peoples in the US and Canada, the reparations debates in the US and UK regarding slavery, the campaigns for repatriation of cultural objects from colonial-era collections, these are not on the verge of producing comprehensive redistribution. They are operating in political environments shaped precisely by the power of the interests they are challenging. But they are moving the terms of the public debate in ways that were not happening a generation ago. And the history this video has been exploring is part of that movement. The more completely the story of British family wealth and its connections to the pre-Columbian Americas and to the colonial enterprise and to the specific mechanisms of wealth extraction and transfer can be told, the harder it is to maintain the comfortable narrative in which the wealth of the old families is simply the natural result of virtuous management over long periods, and in which the poverty of the communities that were displaced to create it is simply the natural result of historical circumstance. The families that controlled Britain before the royal family are not separate from the family that currently occupies the throne. The current royal family is embedded in exactly the same network of aristocratic wealth and institutional connection that has shaped British elite society for centuries. The Cecils and the Howards and the Cavendishes and the Grosvenors and the various other families whose money and whose political support built the British system within which the monarchy operates are not rivals to the crown. They are its context, its social ecosystem, the wider world in which it makes sense. Understanding that the crown is not the source of British power, but rather one of its symbols, one of the most visible and most carefully managed symbols, but still a symbol, is the beginning of understanding where the power actually is and where the money actually went. The money did not go to the crown. The crown's wealth, though substantial, is a relatively small proportion of the accumulated wealth of the British elite as a whole. The money went into the estates and the trusts and the financial instruments and the offshore structures and the family offices and the philanthropic foundations and the cultural institutions and the educational endowments and the political donations and the media ownerships of the families that have been the real governing power of Britain. For the question of what a genuine accounting looks like remains open, and it remains open in both. There is something almost vertiginous about following this history to its edge. The vertigo comes from recognizing that the landscape around you, wherever you are in Britain or North America, is not neutral. It is inscribed with the consequences of specific decisions made by specific people over specific periods of time, and the inscriptions are still there if you know how to read them. The country house in the English countryside, sitting in its parkland with its kitchen gardens and its stables and its church in the grounds, is a text that is legible once you understand the language. The parkland was made by evicting people from their common lands. The house was built with money that came from somewhere, from the wool trade, or the monastic dissolution, or the slave trade, or the colonial enterprise, or some combination of all of them. The church in the grounds was a proprietary church, subject to the family's control, and in many cases literally the private chapel of the family, rather than a community institution, in any meaningful sense. The gatehouse and the ha-ha and the carefully managed views were designed to enforce a specific experience of the landscape, one in which the family's power over the territory was aesthetically expressed in every direction. The mound in the Ohio field, the one that the farmer notices as a slight rise in the landscape and drives the tractor over without particular curiosity, is also a text. It says that someone was here, that they chose this place for reasons that mattered to them, that they organized sufficient labor to build something lasting, that they buried their dead or marked their cosmological understanding in a form that has survived millennia. The text is harder to read because the interpretive tradition that would make it legible was disrupted by the same processes that built the English country house. but the text is there. The connection between the English country house and the Ohio mound is not obvious. It requires a long chain of inference and historical research and archival work to establish. But the chain exists, and following it produces a different understanding of both objects. One in which the English country house is not simply a beautiful old building in a pretty landscape, but a monument to a specific history of accumulation and displacement. And the Ohio mound is not simply an interesting archaeological curiosity, but a monument to a civilization whose displacement was part of the process that built the country house. This is why the history matters, not because it produces immediate actionable conclusions, though it does have implications for policy debates that are genuinely live. Not because it changes what any individual can do in their daily life, though understanding the history more completely does change how one sees and interprets the world, but because the story that a society tells about itself is part of the structure of that society, part of the system that maintains certain arrangements and makes them seem natural and inevitable, rather than contingent and historical. The thin narrative, the one in which British history is about kings and queens and battles and the heroic march of progress, and in which American history begins with the Pilgrims and proceeds through the Founding Fathers to the present, is not merely incomplete. It is actively misleading in ways that serve specific interests. The richer narrative, the one that includes the Godwinsons and the dissolution of the monasteries, and the Virginia Company and Cahokia, and the Hopewell astronomers and the plantation economy, and the Bank of England and the offshore trusts, is harder to tell and harder to absorb, but it is the narrative that actually connects cause to effect across the full span of the history it is describing. The families who controlled Britain before the royal family are still here. The civilizations that inhabited North America before the British arrived have left descendants who are still here. The money that connected them, that flowed from one system to the other, through the mechanisms of colonization and trade and financial intermediation, is still here, still held in the various structures and vehicles and institutions through which the accumulated wealth of 5 centuries of extraction maintains itself. What happens next is not determined by the history. History describes how we arrived at the present. It does not dictate what the present does with itself, but it does establish the actual stakes of the choices that the present faces, the actual scale of the redistributions and reckonings and acknowledgements that are being discussed, the actual depth of the historical roots of current inequalities, and the actual continuity between the families that built those inequalities and the families that currently benefit from them. The Domesday Book recorded the landholdings of the families that William the Conqueror had imposed on England in 1086. Some of those families, or families descended from them through the female line, or families that acquired their assets through marriage or purchase, still hold land in England today. The chain is long. It has many links. Many of them are obscure. Some of them pass through places and processes that polite history prefers not to examine. But the chain is real, and it runs from the conquest of England to the colonization of North America to the financial architecture of the modern global economy. Following it is not the same as resolving it, but following it is the beginning of the kind of understanding that makes honest resolution possible, if and when the political will to pursue it exists. For now, the following is enough. The understanding that the story of who controlled Britain before the royal family is also the story of what happened to the civilizations that built Cahokia and Newark and Serpent Mound. That the money that went from the Ohio Valley into the ledgers of the Virginia Company and the Bank of England and the country house accounts is still present in the world, changed in form but continuous in substance. That the distance between the ancient British families and the ancient American peoples is not the distance between the sophisticated and the primitive, between the historical and the prehistorical, between the real and the legendary. It is the distance between the winners and the losers of a specific historical process that is still ongoing. And understanding that distance, measuring it accurately, tracing its origins in the specific decisions of specific families and the specific mechanisms they used to extract and protect and transfer wealth, is the first step toward a world in which the distance is honestly acknowledged rather than mystified and celebrated and turned into tourism. There is one more thread to pull before this story reaches whatever temporary end a story like this can reach, and that is the thread connecting the specific mysteries of pre-Columbian America to the specific curiosities of the families who first documented them. The early collectors, the people who assembled the first serious accounts of indigenous American material culture, and the first attempts at systematic description of pre-Columbian sites, were embedded in the same networks of aristocratic and commercial wealth that this story has been examining. They were funded by it, in many cases. They moved through the same social circuits. They shared the same assumptions about the world and about the relative standing of different civilizations within it. And yet some of them looked at the mounds and the earthworks and the artifacts and saw something that their ideological framework was not designed to accommodate. Caleb Atwater, who produced the first comprehensive survey of Ohio earthworks in 1820, was an Ohio lawyer and politician, connected to the same land speculation networks as the major political figures of his day. His attribution of the mounds to a Hindu people from Asia was nonsense, but his actual descriptions of the earthworks he documented were careful and sometimes moving in their acknowledgement of the scale and sophistication of what he was looking at. He wrote of the great circular earthworks near Chillicothe that they were constructed with a degree of skill and labor which astonishes the beholder. His astonishment was genuine. His theoretical framework for explaining what had astonished him was entirely inadequate, but the astonishment was real. Squire and Davis, whose 1848 Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley remains a foundational document in American archaeology, were similarly placed. Davis was an Ohio physician with extensive connections to the commercial and political networks of the Ohio Valley. Squire was a journalist and later a diplomat with political ambitions. Their survey of the Ohio earthworks was funded partly by the American Antiquarian Society, which was founded in 1812 by Isaiah Thomas, a wealthy Massachusetts printer and publisher with extensive commercial interests. The institutional infrastructure of early American archaeology was built on the same commercial wealth that was simultaneously developing the territories it was studying. But Squire and Davis described the Newark earthworks with care sufficient to allow later researchers to establish their astronomical alignments. They measured and documented enough that the basic physical record survived even as the sites themselves were partially destroyed by subsequent development. Their work was shaped by the assumptions of their time and their class, but some of what they saw broke through those assumptions and demanded honest description, regardless of whether the theoretical framework could accommodate it. This tension between the ideological needs of the colonial enterprise and the genuine curiosity of individuals embedded in it who could not look at Cahokia or the Newark earthworks without recognizing something extraordinary runs through the entire history of the documentation of pre-Columbian American civilization. The documentation was shaped by ideology, but it was also shaped by genuine intellectual engagement with remarkable things, and the record it created is now available to be read differently than the creators intended. The great collections of pre-Columbian American material in British museums, assembled through the mechanisms of colonialism, are now accessible to descendants of the cultures that created those objects. The digital documentation of sites that have been partially or entirely destroyed preserves information that would otherwise be lost. The genetic and isotopic and chemical analysis techniques of modern archaeology reveal dimensions of pre-Columbian civilization that were invisible to the observers of the 18th and 19th centuries. The story is being supplemented and corrected by new tools that were not available to the people who first told it, and the descendants of the pre-Columbian civilizations, the indigenous peoples of North America, whose cultures were disrupted and in many cases nearly destroyed by the colonial enterprise, have never stopped being the primary authorities on their own histories and the primary claimants to the heritage of their ancestors. The documentation that the colonial collectors and the government archaeologists and the museum curators produced is a supplement to that authority, not a replacement for it. The most sophisticated contemporary archaeology of pre-Columbian North America is done in consultation with the living descendants of the people it is studying, or by members of those communities themselves. The Muskogee Creek Nation, whose ancestors built and inhabited many of the southeastern mound sites, has its own scholars and its own interpretations of those sites. The Osage Nation, whose oral traditions include accounts of their relationship to the Cahokia region, has perspectives on the Mississippian heritage that no outside archaeologist possesses. The various Pueblo nations of the Southwest bring to Chaco Canyon and the other ancestral sites a knowledge of cosmological systems and ceremonial practices that is not recoverable from the archaeological record alone. The knowledge survived. It changed form and lost some content through the disruptions of colonization, but it survived. The British families that funded the colonial enterprise and whose capital shaped the institutions that documented pre-Columbian North American civilization are one thread in a much larger tapestry. They are an important thread because their wealth and their institutional connections shaped the terms on which the documentation occurred, and because the ideological needs of their enterprise shaped what was documented and how it was interpreted. But they are not the whole story. They are the thread that runs from the country houses of England to the chartered companies, to the colonial land grants, to the Indian removal to the archaeological museums. And following that thread is one way into the much larger and more complex story of what pre-Columbian North America was and what its relationship to the world that replaced it has been. The money went to Britain. Some of it came back. Some of it never left. Some of it is still in the offshore structures and the family trusts and the private companies that the British aristocratic families use to maintain their wealth across generations and tax regimes. Some of it is in the cultural institutions, the museums and the galleries and the universities that were built with the profits of the colonial enterprise and that now house the artifacts and the documentation of the civilizations the colonial enterprise destroyed. Some of it is in the ground, in the form of the earthworks and mounds and agricultural terraces and fire-managed landscapes that the pre-Columbian people of North America left behind, and that the money that displaced them was never sufficient to erase entirely. There is something that happens when you sit with all of this, when you let the full weight settle, rather than rushing toward some conclusion designed to resolve the discomfort. The discomfort is the point. The discomfort is what the thin narrative, the official history, with its kings and queens and heroic march of progress, is specifically designed to prevent. The Serpent Mound is still in Adams County, Ohio. On a clear night, if you stand at the right point on the ridge, you can see the same stars that the people who built it would have seen. The Hopewell astronomers encoded those stars in geometry that has lasted 2,000 years. The Chatsworth estate in Derbyshire is also still there. The Cavendish family's occupation goes back to the 16th century and the dissolution of the monasteries. Both of these things exist in the world, and the connection between them, the historical chain of events and decisions and transfers and accumulations that links the culture that built the mound to the culture that built the country house, is not a metaphor. It is a historical reality, complex and contested, and still being excavated, but real. The families who controlled Britain before the royal family settled into its current ceremonial form are still part of this story. They have not dissolved into democracy or meritocracy. They are still here, maintaining position through mechanisms more sophisticated and more difficult to challenge than the explicit hereditary privileges of earlier periods. And the civilizations that occupied North America before the British arrived are still here too, through their descendants and their earthworks and the oral traditions that were never entirely destroyed. The mystery of where the money went is part of a larger mystery. What do we owe to the past? What does the past owe us? What do we do with the knowledge that the prosperity of some in the present connects directly to the dispossession of others in the past? There is no clean answer. There is only the question, kept alive, examined honestly, pursued wherever the evidence leads. The stars the Hopewell astronomers tracked are still there. The offshore structures that hold portions of Cavendish and Grosvenor wealth are still there. The gap between the two is the history of Britain and North America over 5 centuries, and the question of whether that gap can be honestly named, honestly addressed, and eventually honestly resolved is the question all of this history is ultimately building toward. Not as an accusation, not as an answer, just as a question, kept alive in the space between what we know and what we are still willing to face.